So, Berto, I have a question for you. Are we made for monogamy?
Oh, like you and me?
Well, like
humans.
Humans in general.
Humans. Well, that's a hard question because made is a loaded word. If I take it to mean, did we mostly evolve to be monogamous animals? I would say probably not at the genetic level, but I think our societies evolved in conjunction with our genetics to a point where monogamy seems to have a lot of advantages for organizational purpose.
Well, so let's investigate it because we've talked about it before on the podcast, but I recently came across some articles. Actually, Famous Stranger in Linden sent some stuff in, and I kind of wanted to just do a review of the evidence and just really try to figure out what do we know about humans? What do we know about primates? What do we know about our history and society and the data that we can find in our behavior today? And because it's a thing that I think a lot of people struggle with in terms of, aren't we supposed to be monogamous? And I just think there's a lot of questions to be asked. And I think there's a lot of benefit to knowing the data because once we understand the data, then we understand the situation. I think we can be kind of freed with that knowledge. Like for people out there, for yourself, how do you feel about monogamy? Think about that. Do you want to be monogamous? Do you like monogamy? Do you value monogamy? How many sexual partners have you had? How many people have you kissed romantically? How many people have you liked romantically? How many people have you fantasized about sexually, including porn stars? Is it one person? Is it thousands of people? Have you ever cheated even though you didn't want to hurt your partner? Have you ever thought about cheating even though you didn't want to hurt your partner? Monogamy is clearly the ideal in our society, right? I mean, how do we know that, Berto?
I think starting from religious institutionalization of monogamy, but when you see it in our literature, in our shows, in our movies, just in the way that the highlight of so many stories is, and they got married, and they lived happily. They too lived happily ever after. He rescued her. She rescued him sometimes, but that kind of thing.
Right. All we have to do to understand our values is to look at our movies and TV shows and look at what the protagonists and the heroes do. And I want to go into that also, but before going into that, let's introduce the podcast. This is called the Psychology in Seattle podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Kirk Honda. I'm a therapist and a professor.
My name is Humberto Castañeda, and I sell Weights Light.
So, in our society, monogamy is the ideal. And we'll get into TV and movies in a second, but other things that I can think of off the top of my head is that we have all these phrases for when one gets a divorce or when one breaks up. We called it failed relationships or a failed marriage.
Oh, that didn't work out, did it?
Yeah. I come from a broken family.
Right.
If someone's been married 3 times, it's subject of ridicule.
You're not, in certain religions, you're not allowed to divorce.
Slut shaming is essentially just an expression of the ideal of monogamy for anybody, regardless of gender, to have had sex with more than what society thinks you're supposed to have sex with. You're suddenly a bad person. So getting into movies and TV shows.
Oh, sorry. And I would even say that the only example we have globally of institutionalized non-monogamy seems sort of oppressive to our view. It's these one dude with a harem of somewhat involuntary women, and so it's not like that we see examples of alternatives that are institutionalized in other places that seem fine.
Right. Or a slut man who has a lot of women that he's dating and tricking them into having sex with him and stuff. And we look at that and despise it. Yeah. So I was thinking, I was thinking a similar thing. I was thinking movies, TV, love and romance and marriage and monogamy is just so prevalent. But I started thinking, well, what if that's one of the themes? What are all the themes in movies and TV? So I actually looked around, and there are people who identify 10 different themes that are typical to our stories, particularly in the West. What do you think those are?
themes about the relationships or about the monogamy aspects?
In addition to monogamy.
Oh, in addition to monogamy. Okay. Faithfulness.
Right. So reason versus faith.
Yeah.
Can you think of a movie that would have that?
And I think that we value, to make sure we're on the same page, that I think society values faith.
Well, regardless of what society values, there's a theme.
Okay, sure. Reason versus faith.
Yeah.
Well, the story of, I think Christopher Columbus is one example where there was faith that there was going to be this other land, right? There's like a very big story. I think movies like Braveheart, where there's faith that everything's stacked against us, but we will somehow overcome this terrible thing.
Right.
Martin Luther King, like any of those stories.
Great. Raiders of the Lost Ark is kind of that way. What's another theme that you can think of?
Okay, another theme would be, rich versus poor, maybe like class struggle.
Okay. Is there a broader topic to that?
Us versus them sort of thing, like
good versus evil.
Good versus evil, certainly. Yeah.
Right. Star Wars, Lord of the Rings.
Right.
A lot of good versus evil.
Right.
Every fantasy movie for sure. What's another theme?
Let's see. Well, I guess what I'd say is the hero's journey of the nobody becomes the hero.
Yeah,
right?
Coming of age is what it's called.
Age.
Harry Potter, Star Wars. What else?
Another one would be this would be sort of the collapse of civilization. I'm thinking of stories where they're not as common these days, actually, but it used to be a very common theme. Tragedies, like lots of Shakespeare plays were tragedies, where everything was at the start of the play, everything seems to be going great, and by the end, everything is in disaster.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to.
It's like disaster movies are an example of that.
Right, it's hard to fit everything into a neat category, but I would say this is what you're talking about is what they call the theme of death.
Sure.
Just like people die.
Yeah.
Unforgiven, No Country for Old Men. Just like it's a tragedy.
Right.
Bad things happen. What's another?
Another one might be betrayal. Like
what do
you call it? Spies or
Well, so I might put that in justice. Like it's called the justice theme.
Justice.
There's also family drama like The Godfather or Back to the Future. There's also perseverance like Rocky. There's also sacrifice like Lord of the Rings. And then you almost kind of got to this as humanity versus technology.
Yeah.
Like 2001 or Terminator, this kind of thing.
Sure.
And love. And it's, by the way, almost always heterosexual monogamy, by the way. That's headed towards marriage. That's the theme.
Yeah.
And, it's hard to think of a movie that doesn't have this in it. This heterosexual monogamy, long-term, forever. At the end of Lord of the Rings, none of us think that Aragorn is going to divorce Arwen.
Right.
We're like, they're going to be together forever.
Yeah.
I mean, that's just how it's going to work.
That's how it's going to work.
Of course, there's no other option.
Right.
And so this reflects our ideal. Aragorn doesn't have another woman on the side.
Nope.
Aragorn isn't like, well, we'll give it 10 years and see how it goes.
You don't see them fighting already.
Right. So that's a whole other thing. It's just like normalizing of just normal everyday relationship issues. So name any movie that we haven't talked about so far, just the first movie that comes in your head. And then we'll see if love is a theme in that movie.
Marriage Story.
Okay, yeah, obviously. So now you could see it in certain elements of the movie as the tension of this theme of heterosexual monogamy, in that, I don't know about you, but I was kind of hoping they would get back together.
Of course.
And they'd work it out.
Yeah.
Now, my artistic side was hoping they wouldn't, because I would think that would be too much of a cop-out. But there was an emotion inside of me, a wish that they would work it out and they would, find...
Right.
They would come back together somehow.
Well, can you think of a movie where throughout the movie, say, husband and wife are fighting quite frequently? Some of them are kind of ugly fights, not physical, but just kind of nasty fights. But that's not even the theme of the movie. And they don't divorce or get back together. Like that's just part of the movie.
Right. Whenever you have so I actually discovered this trope is that when you have a movie that's oriented towards men, the first time, the hero's the male, the first time you see the woman, if they're already involved in a relationship, the first time you see the woman is in what context?
If it revolves around the man?
If it's a male-oriented movie.
Oh, something like she's getting in the way of his goals.
No, like a scene. Think of a scene, like the first scene when you're introduced to the fact that he has a wife.
A wife.
What's the first scene we see her in?
She's in the kitchen with the kids.
Could be, but another, and of course I haven't done a full study, but in my head, the frequent thing that I see, if it's a male-oriented film, like he's a Marine or something, it's in bed.
Oh, sure. Yeah, I could see that too.
Like in the morning, they're familiar with each other, they're playful, and they have morning sex.
Yes, that's fair.
If it's a female-oriented movie...
I was thinking of the scene in... because this is also a trope. Like the protagonist comes down the stairs, the kids are like, "Hi, Daddy," and the wife's cooking the breakfast, and then he's off, and then the story starts.
Right.
But maybe that was after the sex scene.
Yeah. There has to be some acknowledgement of his sexual power over her in the beginning. I mean, not over her, but that she wants to have sex with him, and that they have an active sex life.
She's blessed him to us. Like, yeah, this is a cool guy.
Right.
He's the kind of guy me, who is an attractive female, would have in bed.
If it's a female-oriented movie, like Divergent, for example, the first time we see the male love interest, what's the scene we usually see?
Oh, man, she's kicking his ass or something. I don't know.
He's playing with kids.
Oh, okay.
and listening to her feelings.
Wait, which one's Divergent?
It's like a Hunger Games ripoff.
Oh, I know what you're talking about. Yes.
But anyway, so name another movie.
Raiders of the Lost Ark. We already talked about it. Okay, sorry. No, different one.
Oh yeah, different one.
Yeah, just Quentin Tarantino's Pulp Fiction. That's all.
Okay, so Pulp Fiction, we have definitely a romantic situation between.
There's a couple actually
between Uma Thurman and yeah. So the central innocence of the movie is introduced later in the movie when you have the French girl and Bruce Willis.
Yeah.
And there's no talk about them being with anyone else.
It's a chopper, baby.
They're going to be together for the rest of their life.
That's right.
So even in a movie that's as brutal as Pulp Fiction, and of several different stories, one of the central relationships is the ideal of heterosexual monogamy.
Well, you could sort of sense that the tension of the Uma Thurman and John Travolta is the frustration that, oh man, they could have worked out.
Right.
Those two could have been our...
Name another movie.
Princess Bride.
So obviously right there, it's implied that neither of them have had sex with anyone else.
Right.
They were in love they met when they were young.
Yeah.
And
First love.
At the end of the movie, it's true love.
True love.
Marriage.
Actually, it's true love.
Yeah. To believe. He probably lost at cards, and he's worried about, anyway. Name a third movie.
Rounders.
Okay.
That's an interesting one.
So that's the one with
Matt Damon
and what's her face?
Edward Norton. I always forget her name.
Yeah, she's English, I think, British. God, it's on the tip of my tongue. Anyway, her.
Yes.
And they are, there's a love story there. Now, this is a story about gambling.
Right. But,
story B is our longing for these two characters to fall in love and be together forever. I want to say her name's like Miranda or Minerva.
That sounds right. And in fact, the frustration in that movie, which is a great movie, but part of the thing that makes it a good movie is that we are forced to endure this character giving up on this seemingly supportive relationship for chaotic reasons, because part of us is like, oh, come on, she supported you through your gambling addiction.
Right. That's the tragedy of this movie is that Matt Damon's character, he allows his hubris or his pursuit of fame or greatness to get in the way of the true thing he should, the tragedy of the movie is that he's losing this heterosexual monogamous stuff. Gretchen Mol was
Gretchen Mol.
I was thinking of the other woman actually I was thinking of his Good Will Hunting counterpart.
Oh, I know what you're talking about.
Who is God damn it, it's taking me so long to figure out who's in it. Minnie Driver is her name. Okay.
Really fun moments when you're waiting for answers.
So, and by the way, Jeopardy, such a sad situation for Alex Trebek. But it's just a great thing that our local Ken Jennings is the greatest of all time. Did you know he just won? They brought back the best competitors of all time in our local Seattle.
Oh my goodness.
Guy, Ken Jennings.
I did not know that.
Whom a friend of mine actually knows pretty well. So I feel like I know greatness. Anyway, so now, so that's just movies. So that reflects to us, and that obviously, if you're going to talk about East Indian movies, Japanese movies, all around the world, heterosexual monogamy to some degree is considered to be a major theme in the way we tell ourselves the ideals of life.
Right.
And there's almost no variation. We're not talking about same-sex relationships. We're not talking about polyamorous relationships. We're not talking about serial monogamy. They don't ride off into the sunset and say, well, let's give this 2 years and break up and let's see other people in life.
Like literally the only exceptions here in modern world are like in the Middle East. And I don't know what their media is like. I don't know what their movies are like, if they make movies that are, if that'd be an interesting question. Does the romantic aspect involve multiple women in that case? Is it still,
I don't think the average person in the Middle East has multiple
wives. They can't afford it probably.
Well, I think that's rich people. Yeah.
Yeah.
So around the globe, there's a lot of different opinions about it, and we could go on and on about this. But anyway, so the rest of this conversation, a lot of my notes are based on this article that famous patron Lyndon sent us by Patrick Clarkin, PhD, titled "Humans Are Blank Anogamous," blank ogamous. And it's a blog essentially, and he, systematically goes through a lot of the science, and so a lot of the details from what I'm about to say is from there. So I want to credit that. I got data from other places as well, but anyway. So let's go into terminology, monogamy. Yeah. So monos in Greek means what?
Uno.
Alone, right? And gamos, monogamy, means what?
Love.
Marriage.
Oh, sorry. Right.
Similar, but marriage. So monogamy is...
Philo is...
love.
Love, yeah.
Like Philadelphia. Yeah. So the terminology... So the term of... Yeah, like Anglophile.
Yes. Right.
Necrophile.
I was trying to get where the brother part was. Delpha, maybe?
Yeah.
I don't know.
So the term monogamy is used not only for humans, but it's used for animals as well.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of confusion around the term because it can refer to a lot of different types of monogamy. Like what? What do you think?
Well, like romantic monogamy versus just like functional monogamy.
What do you mean by functional?
Well, if you're talking about animals, they're literally just pragmatically together.
But what do you mean by together?
In love.
How do we measure together?
Oh, as in they're not having sexual encounters with other animals.
Right.
And they travel together, or they stay in the same area or whatever, like co-located.
Right.
And yeah.
But it gets weird because what if you have a couple among gibbons, for example, and they, they pair bond at a young age and they're together until they die. And they generally only have sex together, but occasionally either one of them might have sex with another person. Do we call that monogamy, or do we call that something else? Another is, let's say you only have sex 3 times in your lifetime as a particular animal, and it's only with one other individual, but you don't spend any time with that individual. Right. Are you monogamous? So it gets kind of weird. So the different areas, you have marital monogamy, humans marrying of 2 people. That doesn't necessarily include sexual monogamy. Plus, if you're married and say you meet at 16, you're virgins, you have sex together, but you fantasize about other people, is that monogamy? I don't know. Classical monogamy, which is marrying a virgin and staying together. So that's another thing. It's like a lot of times when we're talking about monogamy, we're talking about, well, of course,
temporary monogamy.
You had sex with people before, you know what I mean? It's not like...
And after.
Yeah.
And during.
So serial monogamy is partnership with one person at a time. Social monogamy, close physical proximity, working together. Sexual monogamy, genetic monogamy, meaning that you only have kids with that particular person, and so on. And this is in opposition to what other kinds of words? We've already said a few of them.
Polygamy, duogamy, I don't know, triogamy, I don't know. What other ones? I mean, well, like, what do you call it? Asexuality, like when you're not...
Yeah.
I don't know what the word would be for, like, you don't have a gammy, you're not married. Agamy?
Well, and you're having sex?
Not just with yourself, right? So it's...
Right, so, well...
Agamy.
Right, well, asexual.
Yeah. So, but polyamory is the... polygamy, polyamory would be the ones that come to mind.
Right, swinging,
yeah.
Non-monogamy, polygyny is different than polygamy, and you have polyandry and all these kinds of other words. Related terms, we have homogamy, which is mating with people within the same ethnic or sociocultural background. We have exogamy, referring to both humans and other species,
exogamy?
Meaning one leaves the natural group that you're in to find potential mates. So, for example, for us, we have evidence in our bones record that indicate that Australopithecine females would leave to have sex with other people. Heterogamy, endogamy, anyway. So there's just a lot of terms, and it gets confusing. And so we'll try to be specific instead of just saying monogamy. All right. So actually, in looking at my notes, I'm gonna shift things around. So there's a lot of evidence that we're not monogamous, by the way. But I want to talk about first the evidence that we're monogamous, partly because it's shorter.
Sure.
And I just want to establish that up front. So let's just stick to, and maybe we'll refute some of this stuff as we go, but let's talk about evidence that we're monogamous. What do you think?
Okay, well, I think there is the natural, it seems to be natural human jealousy reaction, not just to romantic jealousy. I just mean even, kids feeling, we even talked about this, how maybe it comes from the sense of fairness. So then when they start feeling like something is unfair, they feel that sense of envy, and jealousy. And so if you then take that to, well, if humans are going to be in relationships, it's quite likely that that's going to manifest, or that jealousy is going to manifest in those relationships. Therefore, because we have that aspect of natural tendencies towards wanting our own thing and controlling our environment and guarding against others, therefore that is going to lead us down a path where monogamy fits better with that model. So I could see that argument.
Okay.
And that's not like saying that the evolution was, oh yeah, monogamy is a good idea. It was more like, hey, this jealousy thing seems useful, and the side effect is, oh, I want to only have this one woman or one man.
How would we benefit from only having one man or one woman?
It's a side effect. It's not a benefit in this model. It's a side effect that maybe for other reasons, like resource gathering, protection from the environment and other humans, jealousy became useful.
Okay.
And as a side effect, they're like, oh, well, yeah, I only want this one mate.
So interesting.
So that's one.
You're not going to get a lot of people proposing that speculation, but it's perfectly fine. I mean, we just don't know. It certainly could have been that way.
But you could see how, because why do people want their guns, and why do people want their house? And I want a house with a fence, and I want, like, it's a lot of this protection. I want to protect against others and things, right? So you could see along those lines something like, well, therefore, if I'm in a relationship, I want to protect that relationship.
Right, like people will be possessive about things that don't make a lot of sense.
Yeah. And
it, stands to reason, like, well, maybe our possessiveness over our mate is related to that.
So that's one idea. Another idea is actually, or another example of why it might be inherent. This one is women don't have a ton of a ton of opportunities for creating new life. They're not like other animals. You know, they have these cycles. They have a limited amount of eggs, a limited amount of time in their life where they can give birth. It is a risky endeavor. When you are giving birth, you're giving birth through these tiny canals to these big-headed beasts. You can die easily. The child can die, so you need protection. And so it is advantageous to be like, no, you're staying with me. First of all, I need you. You need to be good because I need you to be able to put good things inside of me. And two, you're staying with me because this is risky. I might die. I need you to protect this child. So that angle, kind of like the procreation angle.
Yeah.
And then another angle might simply be again, because I think that what we call society and culture is a blurry side effect of our genetics. I think that over time, it became less contentious to have everyone sleeping with everyone, because when you had everyone sleeping with everyone, it might have led to greater instability as a society, more infighting, more dissolving, sub-branching, people breaking off, things like that. And so then maybe it became more advantageous over millennia to be like, no. You stick with her, you stick with him. You guys, like, we have some separation here. And that might have been a societal advantage.
Good. That last one is evidence that we're inherently not monogamous, but
sure,
but culturally monogamous.
You mean genetically inherently not monogamous,
right?
But yes,
and we'll get to that theory as well. That hypothesis later.
It's just because this is a bone that I like to pick with you, which is that we like to distinguish, because you often do this. Well, that's society, that's not genetics, and I hear you. But the question of where our society came from is a chicken and egg question related to our genetics, because clearly over time, before there was even language, patterns developed as a result of the way we were. And so, it's quite possible that there are still genetic aspects that lead to that societal outcome.
Well, quote unquote, everything is genetic because if you include like cause and effect, genetics and our biology is 100% involved in every decision, cultural and otherwise. But the distinction is, not an easy thing to delineate, and it's not an easy thing to discuss because it's just such a weird philosophical thing. And we'll get into this later, but in a nutshell, the question is sort of dumb right from the start. Is like, what are we inherently? What are we naturally? What is our natural state? It is both a ridiculous question because of the reasons that you're stating and others, but also it is kind of a relevant question because for example, we can say with some certainty that we are naturally our natural state is one that involves exercise, right? That if we, for example, choose to sit in front of a computer 16 hours a day, bad things tend to happen. They're not going to happen right away, and someone might be able to exist without those negative effects.
You're being pseudophobic right now.
But we all know that it stands to reason that our quote unquote natural state is to exercise a certain amount every day, and that your risk of things go down when you exercise a certain amount every day. It's inherently, it's natural for us to exercise a certain amount a day, and we can't culture that away. When we do, we see effects like heart disease and depression and anxiety and sleep problems and gaining weight, and we see problems that we as a society deem to be problems, which is a whole other philosophical thing, because everyone dies. What's the point? You know what I mean? So it's just a matter of what we privilege. In the same way, it is a helpful question to look at. What are we, quote unquote, inherently or natural? What were we like before culture came along and started to make value judgments about certain kinds of lifestyles and decisions? And how similar are we to that, and how different are we to that original state? And if we are different, are we seeing ill effects from our attempts to try to be to shove a square peg into a round hole.
Absolutely. And to emphasize this, what makes it so much harder is we aren't actually sort of at a finite state of evolution or at a leaf node of evolution. It's a fluid thing. So take, for example, are humans meant to sprint really fast? Like, well, no. Okay, well, it turns out humans are really great for long distance continuous running. They can basically outrun any animal eventually, but they're not as fast. And you can tear tendons if you run really fast, too soon, when you're too old, blah, 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 blah. But at the same time, it was really useful, and it started being more useful when you could catch animals and blah, blah. And now we have events about it and all these things. So it's a gray zone, right? Same thing with things like, this is the eternal debate with the nutrition. Are humans omnivores? Are we mostly herbivores? Are we mostly carnivores?
Right.
And there's great evidence on all sides.
Right.
You know?
Right. It's a great analogous conversation that most of us can understand that it's worthy to investigate. Yeah. What is our natural eating situation? At the same time, it was never natural for us to have access to food from around the world. We only had access to the local food that was available. Yeah. So to say that acai berries are like the secret ingredient to human happiness is ridiculous, since acai berries were only available to like 0.01% of the population of the earth.
Absolutely.
So it can't be that acai berries are essential to humans. But it is a worthy question, and I think all of us kind of understand that we can't just decide, okay, I'm going to eat X, and that's all I'm going to eat for the rest of my life. And even though it's not likely that's the way I was designed to live, that's going to go well for me. But we also understand that there's a lot of different ways to live happily and healthfully. Someone can be vegetarian and be perfectly happy and healthy. Someone can eat meat and be perfectly happy and healthy.
That's right.
And so, so we've learned that through data that there's a lot of different ways to be healthy, and our natural state must have been adaptive to the situation. There must have been humans that might have had no access to meat that managed to survive, and there were other tribes of humans that's all they ate. I mean, there are people in Alaska that, from what I understand, all they ate was meat, because of the tundra, there wasn't a lot of vegetables to eat, and yet their cholesterol's okay and stuff. And so one, we adapt to blah, blah, blah. So it is an interesting question because, for example, we have a lot of people in our society right now who are lonely, who are depressed, who have low self-esteem, who are beating themselves up because their marriage isn't going well, who are sad about their parents getting divorced, who are ripping apart their finances and their lives because of going through a court divorce system, who are literally killing themselves because they're being ridiculed for not being married or for getting a divorce 3 times, or because they don't fit into the round hole. They have a tendency to want to be with a lot of people, but they force themselves into monogamy. It doesn't go well, or vice versa. And it is a relevant question, and it is worth exploring. So, it's worthy, and it's a ridiculous question, we said earlier, because we cannot separate culture from genetics. Yeah. Genetics emerged in culture. Genetics emerged in the environment. It never emerged without it. So it always is in consideration of the environment. Mm-hmm. And so, and we're adaptive. But anyway, so.
Oh, sorry. And one last thing is we continuously get hit by an asteroid, meaning there's no genetic evolution pattern that could have prepared the dinosaurs to deal with being hit by an asteroid. And right now we are dealing with certain exponential growths of our tech and our society that our genetic evolution there's no way it could have prepared us for. So therefore, if we were right now studying the question of is monogamy natural, and we had little time travel bubbles, and we were asking the question as of, a thousand, let's say 6,000 years ago. We can analyze each little pocket of humans 6,000 years ago and look at, well, that question, is monogamy natural? That already would be hard enough. But now we're talking about like in a global environment where people can travel almost instantly via plane, definitely instantly via electronics, right, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Well, contraception.
Yeah. Everything.
Yeah. So the hypotheses that we're meant to be monogamous and that we're naturally monogamous, the hypothesis is why we evolved to be monogamous as a species. It has to do with some of the things you're saying, is that we became monogamous to avoid inbreeding with children. Females were too far apart to allow non-monogamy is one hypothesis. Mate guarding, you kind of mentioned that a little bit, that jealousy. It actually does help. In certain species will do this, is they will mate guard as a way to prevent other people from impregnating your female, and vice versa. Females choose a male to act as a bodyguard against predators and other males. You mentioned that. Males are needed to prevent infanticide from other males, and also male parental care means you have double the ability to feed this child and take care of it. So there's a lot of strong hypotheses that you see among other species as to why a species would benefit by being monogamous. So we have some strong hypotheses. Evidence, though, is that many cultures privilege lifelong relationships. Around the world, it seems to be fairly common for cultures to say this is the ideal.
Yeah.
And that could be reflective of, quote unquote, what's natural for us. Hard to know, doesn't necessarily mean that, but it's quote unquote evidence. If it was the opposite, we would have evidence in the opposite. If like no culture around the world thought that marriage long term was a good idea, then we'd be like, well, maybe that's a reflection of our natural proclivities. You know what I mean? We seem to have an urge that manifests itself in the collective to be with people forever, and to be happy when the high school sweethearts manage to stay married for 50 years. That seems to produce happiness in people. And so maybe that's an indication of, quote unquote, our natural state.
You can definitely cut it both ways, right? Because you can see, not even cynically, just over time, you could see the elders of society throughout the millennia going, man, we got to come up with some rules that people can really follow, because this is kind of chaotic, because our natural tendency seem to be to fuck around. So let's, remember that tale we were telling the kids? Why don't we add a little extra chapter to it, and we'll just talk about how they have to stay together with their one mate. And it's kind of, the gods, the rock gods decreed it. And then over time, that becomes like the way to enforce what's better for society. That's one story. But then the other one is like what you're saying, which is over time, people are like, yeah, it seems like we're kind of generally happier in this state. Why don't we just make it official? Like, that's the way it is.
Right. Yeah. The strongest evidence is, in my book and another theorist's book, is that we fall in love across all cultures. We fall deeply in love with individuals. When we like someone, when we love someone, when we find that one person, we have a powerful urge to be with that person. And it's a powerful experience. I mean, all the songs and all the poems and all the movies and, all the stories we tell ourselves, it is, one of the most popular things on Reddit and on YouTube is when someone will propose to someone else.
Yeah.
There's a cute, famous one that occasionally gets reposted on Reddit of there's two women and they're like in Europe somewhere, and someone's filming that they give the camera to, and one of the women gets down on one knee and gets a ring. The woman standing goes, "Oh my God!" and she reaches into her bag and pulls out a ring, and she gets down on her. They both were going to propose to each other on this trip, but one did it anyway. And, we love, it's upvoted, everyone's crying, everyone loves, I don't even know these two people, they could be assholes.
They're two women?
Yeah.
See, this is the problem with same-sex marriage.
Yeah.
You can't know who's going to propose.
It's Jennifer and Steve, what was it? No, Adam and
It's not Adam and...
It's Adam and Eve, not Eve and...
Archie Bunker over here.
So right, it's a powerful experience. We love to even watch people get married. People will go to a wedding, they don't even know the people, they'll cry. You watch rom-com, Crazy Rich Asians, and at the end I'm seeing two actors on the screen get married, and I'm tearing up a little bit.
You watch season after season about how you met your stupid mother.
Right. We have powerful brain mechanisms that are involved not only in oxytocin, but also in basically addiction and quote unquote madness.
Right.
When we fall in love with someone, it's a very powerful experience. So that is biological, man.
Right.
That is not cultural.
Nope.
And so we must have evolved a natural ability or compulsion to pair up.
Although, the poking holes could be, well, first of all, sure. Clearly, animals have developed seasonal, hormonally driven drives that are very intense to woo a mate. And you see that in, even biologically, their plumage changing and stuff like this. So you could imagine that as primates got more, say, complex, and especially as humans started getting more complex, this became still true, but it became harder because now it wasn't good enough to just woo a woman in one afternoon with some muscle flaring and then, oh, cool, we'll have sex. Because society and the whole thing became way more complex. So you had to do something a little more long-term than that and more impressive. And so it had to be drawn out. But yet you needed to motivate the people to stay in it for longer. So you needed a kind of this falling in love sort of sequence. But the intention wasn't ever, but then you're going to stay together for 100 years because you're going to die in 5 years. So don't worry about it.
Right. So, and we'll get to all that later. There's a lot more evidence that we're not, quote unquote, naturally monogamous, and that's one of them. Another one is that sex is usually better with long-term partners. Study by Armstrong et al. 2012. Women reported orgasms in, first hookups, what percentage of women reported orgasms in the United States?
Oh, interesting. 40%.
11.
11?
Yeah.
Oh.
Second or third hookups percentage?
30?
16.
Oh.
And then percentage of people women who reported orgasms in long-term relationship sex.
Okay, 60?
67.
Okay, good.
So we go
69 almost.
So we go from 11 to 15% to 67%.
That's a huge difference.
So now, again, we could point to a lot of different reasons for that. Men not being taught how to have sex, for example. Women being taught that they need to put themselves on the back burner sexually.
But there could be a lot of emotional reasons for it.
But it's evidence-ish that we're, quote unquote, naturally made for longer term relationships, that whatever needs to come into play, we could all agree that orgasms are a good thing and indicate that things are going well. And so it's just one measure of saying, well, it looks like maybe our natural state is long-term relationships because women have more orgasms in that situation.
You could even theorize that, and I don't know if there's any evidence for this, and maybe there isn't, but you could theorize that, hey, since you need a lower stress environment for a successful baby, maybe, in order for women to have kind of that lower stress environment and more fulfillment, you need more attachment.
Right, absolutely. Another study found that 90% of teenagers said they hoped for a lifelong monogamous relationship. So it's just another indication that, either culturally
what
or
percentage
whatever.
You said?
90%.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Helen Fisher is a well-known researcher in love and sexuality. She and her colleagues had a study 2002. Across many cultures, 13 characteristics that were reliably associated with intense romantic love. What do you think those are?
Characteristics associated with intense romantic love.
Yeah. So I'll give you one. Obsessive, intrusive thinking. What else?
Obsessive. Wow. So empathy or, considering the other's needs, I guess.
No. Well, no. You'd think it would be, but it's not part of it, I don't think. Oh, no. A high sense of empathy and altruism toward the other person.
So that. Another one might be the strong family orientation or something like that. Like,
no.
Okay.
These are like when you ask someone, what does it feel like to be in love?
Oh, I see. Okay. Exhilarating feelings like, what do you call it? Like adrenaline rush.
Increased energy and exhilaration.
Yeah, that. Breathlessness, sort of.
Okay, well, I'll put it into this category. Sleeplessness and loss of appetite.
Okay.
So physiological.
Daydreaming.
Thinking, focusing on...
daydreaming about the person, basically.
No, I think that's the obsessive intrusive thinking.
I see. Yeah, that makes sense. Stalking. Like tendencies towards like seeing that person all the time, basically. Like wanting to,
Yeah, no. I mean, that's not one of the ones I get. I mean, obviously that makes sense, but
talking about them all the time, like,
I think that's the obsessive intrusive thinking part of it. Yeah,
that covers a lot.
Or focusing on positive qualities of the other person while overlooking negative ones.
Oh, okay, I see. Yeah.
So I'll just tell you the other ones. So we have obsessive intrusive thinking. We have thinking the other person is unique. That's kind of interesting, right?
Yeah.
Prioritizing emotional union over sexual desire. So it's when we fall in love, it's not just about sex. It's like, we are one. Focusing on positive qualities while ignoring the negative. Increased energy and exhilaration. High sense of empathy and altruism toward the person. Sleeplessness and loss of appetite. Feeling greater connection to the person through adversity. And feeling that intense romantic love is involuntary, but also temporary. So the intrusive thinking part, many respondents to one study who were in love estimated that they thought about the other person what percentage of the time?
95%.
Close, 85%. So 80, they were like, about 85% of my waking hours, I'm thinking about that person. So this is similar to OCD, similar to addiction. Now, so that seems to be strong evidence that we're at least meant to pair bond and maybe by extension monogamy. But again, it's not necessarily evidence of monogamy, which we'll get into later. But it stands to reason that our natural state, for whatever sort of worthless phrase that is, we seem to have evolved into a species at some point that needed to survive by having intense motivation towards another person to, one, get them pregnant and to stay at least together long enough so that the child is out of the hazardous years.
Yeah.
We all understand that a child from 0 to, especially like 0 to 2, is like one of the most vulnerable creatures on the planet. They can't think for themselves. They can barely locomote themselves.
Although, have you seen The Jungle Book? It seems like you can leave them in the forest in the jungle. There's just so many things you need to do, and then let alone the years from 2 to 5 that you need to guide them and help. They can't run very fast, And they seem to want to do everything that would get them killed.
Right. And so there's that. Now, research finds that most divorces in the world occur after how many years?
7 years.
4 years. 4 years of marriage. So it could include, 1 year of courtship or something. So you hear the 7-year itch.
Yeah.
But I think this is a similar thing. I think often what happens is people will have an itch that begins at about year 5, and by the 7th year they really feel it. You know what I mean? So this is evidence that we're serial monogamists at the very least, in that now maybe we fall back in love with that person, have another child with them. Sure. But maybe we fall in love with someone else and we have a child with that other person.
So the cycle, I see. So this would be an interesting theory. It's like, look, Mr. Evolution, we just need like 5 to 7 good years of, rearing this child. Then you can go on with your merry business. And that would make sense, right? It'd be like, you have those intense feelings, you pair bond, you're together, you have the child's safer, and then you're off.
Right. Exactly. So other evidence, other studies will find that we tend to be happiest when we're married, and we tend to live longer when we're married. Similar to, one would say, we tend to be happiest and live longer when we exercise. We tend to be happiest and live longer when we have a well-balanced diet.
Right.
We tend to be happier and live longer when we get to go into nature more often. We tend to, be happier and live longer when we have friends and relationships that are around. And so it seems like, there's evidence that our quote unquote natural state is to be monogamous for the rest of our life after a certain point, and because we live longer. Now, it's not strong evidence, but it's evidence. Okay. So,
and by the way, that's one that the media actually that we produce, it sort of goes backwards with it, right? Most relationships you can think of, the stereotypes are always, my wife said this, or my husband's such an idiot, or whatever, right? Making it feel like that's not happiness, but they have to deal with it. And yet you see the ones that are not pair bonded yet, they're living life to the fullest. They're the adventurer. And then they fall in love. At the end of the story, they fall in love.
Right. We tend to have this, especially in rom-coms and these kinds of stories, that the most ideal time of your life is when you're falling in love.
Right.
And then we have this other bias of, like, if you've been married for 30 years, things are dreary. And you're bored and you're sick of each other,
Yeah, like think about how many rom-coms specifically. You have the woman protagonist, she's kind of considering this guy, and she's talking to her female friend who's been married for a while. And then she's like, well, don't ask me. My husband is just a slob, blah, blah, blah.
Or Woody Allen movies, the protagonist already is married.
Right.
And has been for 20 years.
And it's bored.
Yeah, we clearly really like the beginning, because it makes sense. That's when our hormones really kick in.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's take a break. When we get back, let's go, because most of my notes have to do with the evidence that we're quote unquote promiscuous or non-monogamous. Okay. So let's take a break. What do you say?
Let's do it.
All right, we're back from the break. So, Berto, if a caveman from the old days who were to, get into a time machine that he built and come on this podcast, well, I'm making him he because it's you, and come on this podcast and convince everyone to become a patron, what would he sound like? What would he say?
Oh, I see lots of rock I can build cave with, but one thing I don't see is lots of patron that can build bigger cave with. You support this podcast, patron, and we build big cave together.
Wait, caveman, are you monogamous?
I have many monogamous relationships.
All right, so evidence of promiscuity, and promiscuity not being a negative connotation, just a word that we're using to mean non-monogamous. So let's look at comparison to other animals. So that's one way, that's one line of evidence that scientists will often point to as to, well, let's look at other mammals, let's look at other primates and see what they do, and maybe that's a reflection of our early natural state. A caveat before we go into this is that there's a lot of oversimplification about our primate cousins and about their behavior. For example, a common generalization is chimpanzees are mean, bonobos are nice.
Right.
It's way more complicated than that. Bonobos can be very mean, and chimps can be very nice.
Some of my best friends are bonobos.
And I bet. And the internet, I also say as a caveat, is filled with crappy science. For you listeners out there who actually are scientists, I should have said this at the beginning. For you listeners out there who actually this is your dissertation, pretty much this entire episode is going to annoy you because this isn't an expert. I'm not an expert on the topic.
Except the things I say, they'll love those.
The experts on this topic will be able to speak much more, at length and much more accurately, obviously, and use the right language.
Yeah.
So there's that. But I feel like I'm good enough to be able to at least speak with better accuracy than a lot of people on the internet. I mean, you go to Psychology Today, you go on YouTube, whenever this, because I did a lot of this research, you go on Reddit or something, there is just so much shitty information out there. It's essentially what I see people doing on the internet is they learn one or two facts, and then it sort of confirms the thesis that they want to have about our natural state.
Sure.
And they just say that. And we'll go into that here, some of the details. It'd be like, the detail I said earlier, it'd be like, so actually some, fundamental conservative people in our country will say like, well, God made us to be monogamous.
Right.
Look at all the chemicals involved in falling in love.
Right.
It's obvious that God made us as monogamous. We don't fall in love with 10 people at once.
Right.
We fall in love with them. So that's an example of that, of like cherry picking one detail that's true and not paying attention to all the other details.
Including when the question is raised about, what about when a same-sex person feels those same hormones and feelings?
Right, exactly. So we'll get into that stuff. All right, so let's look at all primates in terms of monogamy. So how many of all the primates, there's 200 plus primate species, what percentage of those species are monogamous? And it depends on the definition. So I'll give you all the studies, but what percentage?
Okay, 30%.
Meaning that lifelong mates living exclusively
of
with...
all 200 species of primates, 30%.
Okay. So one study found that it's 3%.
Yeeks.
And another study found that it's 29%, which is closer.
I was right.
Another
it
study,
confirmed my...
Another study found it was 14%.
Okay.
So it depends on how you look at by definition, what is monogamous. Also, we don't have a lot of, you think, oh, it's 2020, we have tons of data. It's like, we actually don't.
No.
I mean, you have to spend a lot of money and time to observe these primates in their natural environment. You can't observe them in a zoo.
Right.
Because they will exhibit different sexuality in a zoo. So you have to go to the jungle or go to, South America. And,
super complicated.
Yeah.
Dangerous.
And
everything.
They don't have sex right in front of your cameras. You know what I mean? Like you gotta.
But you can interview them.
Yeah. Another study found that 27% were partly monogamous. So it's probably somewhere around 10 to 15% are monogamous.
I was within 100 percentage points, so I was very close.
The very clearly monogamous, there are 2 American monkeys and 2 lemur species that are monogamous. And this is the same rate generally found in all mammals, by the way, which is about 9 to 20%. So
all mammals.
So most mammals, the vast majority of mammals are not monogamous, and the vast majority of primates are not monogamous. But let's get into what we mean by non-monogamous. But let's talk specifically about our closest cousins, which are whom?
The chimps
and
the gorillas.
Bonobos.
Oh, bonobos.
Yeah. We're actually not closely related to gorillas at all, actually.
Well, compared to monkeys, we are. But yeah. Okay. So chimps and bonobos.
Yeah. So chimps and bonobos are our closest cousins. Both live in social groups like us, and both are highly promiscuous compared to most other animals, including other primates. So chimpanzees generally only have sex during ovulation, estrus, and generally only have heterosexual sex for the purpose of reproduction, but not entirely. They could certainly have sex outside of estrus, and they could certainly have non-heterosexual sex for the purpose of reproduction. Females have been observed to copulate with as many as 50 times a day with a dozen different females during estrus.
A dozen different males.
Right. So when a female is in heat,
jeez, okay,
she has sex with a dozen different males for a total of 50 times.
Got it.
A day.
Just trying to guarantee that impregnation, basically.
By anybody.
Yeah.
Bonobos, so that's a very oversimplification. So just imagine whatever that looks like. You have chimpanzees in their quote unquote natural state where the females will go into heat, so to speak, and they have the urge, and they start to put out the signals that they're ready to go biologically and behaviorally. And they also, reach out to other males. The males respond.
Right.
And there's not a lot, there's some mate guarding, but not a lot of mate guarding.
Right.
Clearly, because if a dozen males are having sex with the same female in that time.
Right.
So there's that. Okay. So then bonobos. Similar to chimpanzees, but they generally have sex all the time, not just during estrus. They have homosexual sex.
Right.
They have even sex with infants,
Right.
which can seem really, since they look like humans, that feels bad to us.
Right.
But it doesn't seem to be bad for them. There seems to be a very slight exception for adult mothers to have sex with their adult sons. But even then, it sometimes happens. But aside from that taboo, it seems like everything else is off the table. For example, mothers will have sex with their infant sons.
Interesting.
And they have sex for various reasons. They have sex to relieve tensions between individuals. They have sex to bond, and they have sex for reproduction. There's accounts of when the bonobos find food or a watering hole, and they're all happy. They're all jumping around, and then
They'll just have sex.
they have sex before they even drink the water.
Right.
The speculation is, one, they're so excited they want to have sex, but two, they are worried that they'll try to compete for the water. And so it's like, okay, we're good, right? We're still bonded, let's have sex with each other so we don't fight over this resource.
So this is what makes it so hard for me, because you know how you have this little water bottle every time?
Yeah.
I get really anxious because I feel like we're about to compete for the resource, and I get really horny as a result.
Is that why you're humping my leg right now? So females have sex with males and females of all ages. So bonobos are similar to chimpanzees in terms of when you compare to all species of mammals and animals, but significantly different in that they tend to have sex all the time and mostly for not reproduction reasons, but definitely for reproduction reasons. And they tend to not differentiate between male and female or age or, of childbearing age or anything like that. So now when we compare humans' behavior to bonobos and chimps, who are we more like?
Neither, but chimps sort of.
No, we're more like bonobos. We're considered to be more like bonobos.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Not in our society, but our natural tendencies. Is that what you mean?
No, our society today.
Oh no.
So we'll get into this in a second. When you actually look at actual human behavior, like actual human, and it's hard to know because by what metric, but the experts will state that humans and bonobos, because of the reason that they have sex for a lot of different reasons. That's
sure. Yeah, I could see that. I just mean like we over the millennia developed so many hang-ups or societal rules around what's appropriate and not appropriate that today in the Judeo-Christian world, most of that behavior is completely inappropriate.
And people will be shameful and guilty after doing things.
Sure. I see that, but that's why I was that's why I was asking
looking
if you
at
meant
actual behavior
versus society
and urges. You know what I mean? Not what society necessarily tells us to do.
But I will say that even then, and so I totally agree, and I see the point. But I would say that the average Western person isn't in a constant state of arousal, like let's drop our pants, let's have sex right now. And
neither are bonobos. Right? You can observe bonobos for hours and there won't be any sex. It's not like they're in a constant state of sexuality.
Sure.
But when you do observe them, 24/7, you see a lot of sex happening compared to other primates. That is non-reproduction reasons.
Yeah. And humans also tend to be.
They seem to be doing it for pleasure.
Right.
Chimps or bonobos, whereas chimps comparatively tend not to do it for pleasure.
So I feel like what I was trying to get at is I feel like our society has been modeled closer to the chimps, except strip away all the numbers. Like, yeah, it's just for reproduction and only one at a time.
Yeah, it's funny. It's like we all have an inner bonobo, but our society is trying to make us into chimps.
Yes,
we're trying to
why the violence.
We're trying to fit a bonobo-shaped block into a chimp.
Anus. I mean, what?
So speculation that we actually saw during that documentary, Why We Hate,
right,
was that chimps have to compete for food more than bonobos because they were on this other side of this river. And so the tribes rely more on male aggression to fight for resources. Whereas bonobos had abundant food, so they were allowed to relax more about resource management. And they tend to be more cooperative, and a sex emerged. They adopted sex as a way of being more cooperative, essentially. When males in the bonobo species start to exhibit aggression, it actually isn't helpful for them to do that because it risks injury, it risks pissing off other tribes, and it's just like, look, there's enough food to go around.
Calm down, we'll jack you off.
Exactly. It's exactly that.
Yeah.
And so bonobos, exhibit what they exhibit.
Can you imagine? This would make our world so much better, right? You have this like angry senator, like, oh, I want to ruin the environment, and it was like, hey, calm down, we'll jack you off.
Well, who in our society would have to do that terrible deed?
Yeah, there would be people assigned to that job.
I guess we'd have to elect them, like the vice president in charge of fluffing.
Hey, man, maybe you have to rotate the jobs. Sure, you can be president, but next time you're the fluffer. The pacifier, we call them. The pacifier.
So that's another speculation, right? It's an interesting thing to think, no joke. Are wars and crime, because we're trying to shove ourselves into the chimp camp by not having sex more often, by stigmatizing sex for everyone so that they can't act on their impulses. Again, it sounds ridiculous, but imagine a world in which you have
possessions.
A woman who she gets off work and she is she's tense and she's bothered. And she's coming home, and their kids are they're picking up kids from the daycare, and oh my God. And then all of a sudden, she, just as she's going into the daycare, she sees this hot guy, and she's like, oh, he's pretty hot.
Right.
And imagine a world where she could go over to him and be like, let's do it right here on the sidewalk.
Yeah. I needed some relief.
Yeah. Can you please let me get you erect and, stick it in me and, and let me have a few orgasms or something.
I'll pay you for your trouble. Oh, wait, we do live in that world, except you get arrested.
And then, they have sex. She's like, oh, that felt good. Well, see ya. And she picks up her kids, goes home.
And 9 months later.
And all that took was, let's say, 7 minutes or something, or 15 minutes of time. And literally, you could do it right there on the lawn in front of the daycare, and we don't. That's what bonobos are like.
Now we do have some complications in that we short-circuited some aspects of evolution, and maybe because of that and other factors, we have all these diseases, venereal diseases, and that tends to put a little bit of a hamper on how free these things can be without some risk to the societal structure. But
the reason why we have those is, well, we've always had those. Chimps and bonobos have venereal diseases, and it doesn't
stop them.
Also, the superbugs come around because of the way in which we're global, and so viruses will spread way more readily, and also. We use antibiotics that create superbugs.
Yeah.
The other thing is I always because I actually was asked to years ago to do a talk at a convention for people who had STIs, like permanent ones, like herpes or something. And we have so much stigma about that. But the thing that I always say is let's say we all understand that going to work and interacting with other human beings puts us at risk at getting an infection.
Yep.
It just happens to go through the mouth and the nose.
Yeah.
The flu, common cold, these kinds of things. We all understand, like, well, that's just a part of, I could prevent that by wearing a hazmat suit and maybe not leaving the house.
Yeah.
But that's not the life I want to live. I'm willing to take the risk because, that's okay. People get sick sometimes and you just get through it. No big deal.
Right.
Even herpes of the mouth or something, we just go, well, I'm not going to not kiss anyone for the rest of my life. It's going to happen. But somehow when it comes to infections that have a vector through the genitals, somehow now it's like, oh boy, you got it's the exact same thing. Gonorrhea. Now syphilis can have complications. But,
AIDS though.
But AIDS
became a big game changer in that sense.
Right, and that's because of the globalization, and in the past AIDS probably did jump from monkeys, primates to humans, but the tribe would die off and not have any offspring, and similar kinds of diseases.
Well, that's why I was saying we short-circuited certain aspects of evolution, because in most of these cases, if they're bad enough, they'll die. A lot of people will die over the years. But anyways, all I was trying to get at with that is that in modern day society, that woman will have some inconveniences going to pick up the kids, going to her job, and all these things, where she gets severely sick from her random casual encounters.
Yeah, but anyway.
Yeah.
Now, I'm not proposing that this is the way. I'll always get, whenever I talk this way, I'll always get emails from people like, how dare you propose a quote-unquote ideal future that involves basically like rape of humans. I'm not proposing this.
Right,
There's actually no way.
And it's consensual.
Even if science proves that this is our natural state and we are supposed to be like bonobos, which I don't necessarily believe, we have to live with the way we've already built our society, Like, it's also unnatural for us to drive cars and pump carbon into the atmosphere, but I don't propose that we go back to like a hunter-gatherer society. It actually would probably help us, but...
But you are also not proposing anything non-consensual.
Right.
So
exactly.
There's not any of that.
But people, like, because of their trauma histories, they're somehow threatened by being loosey-goosey with like hypothesized scenarios. The other thing is there are versions of people who do this right now, where they're in the swinger community, and they're like, now they realize there's a law against having sex, in a parking strip, but they might be like, okay, wow, I'm a little bit tense. Hey, swinger community, I need to have sex right now with a man. Can we meet in the bathroom at my work and let's do it? And so there are people who do this. It's consensual and it works for them. Yeah. So it's not unheard of. Yeah. Anyway, so to summarize, among chimps and bonobos here, something like 80 to 97% of primates are non-monogamous. So if you're going to roll the dice, humans are probably also non-monogamous in our past. Our closest cousins are definitely not monogamous. Right. Chimps and bonobos are extremely non-monogamous.
Right.
Chimps have sex with the females have sex with multiple males while they're in estrus.
But they also don't play Fortnite, to be clear.
Yeah. Bonobos have sex seemingly with everyone in their tribe at some point and out in the open, and it's normal, So are we supposed to be like bonobos? Are we supposed to be like chimps? Are we in between? What do you think?
Yeah, like what we were saying. So I really do believe that there is a mixture of practicality and then grotesque overuse of the practicality that happened throughout the years. So I do think there were practical reasons why having people sort of stick at least for several years with one mate were advantageous to building a human society that was survivable. And so I actually think that based on the fact that we tend to be more chimp-like in our temperament, if you will, that I think that seems to be maybe conducive to peace more. But at the same time, there's no outlets for the remainder of our personalities and our instincts. In other words, imagine a model where it's like, yeah, sure. We encourage and give societal benefits to you sort of pairing up, at least for a decade. You don't have to stay together, but just, try it out so you can have some stability, raise a kid or something. Number one. Number two, we take away the stigma of you starting a new relationship. That's okay too. Just don't get people killed in the process. Like number two.
I just want to asterisk that. That assumes that promiscuity leads to anger and jealousy.
Right.
Which I'll get into later, which isn't necessarily true, but go ahead.
Well, at least it seems like
we certainly exhibit that in our current society.
Yeah.
But I'll get to evidence.
Through history.
And through history, for sure. But we'll get to...
all of written history.
Right. The Iliad or
so in other words, it's a hard argument to make that we don't instinctually have those.
Well, we'll get to that.
Okay. But I'll say the third thing is, so hey, Mr. or Mrs., you have some sexual tension, and for whatever reason, your temporary monogamy partner is not available, or you're not interested in that right now. That's okay. There's a total legal sanctioned way for you to do that, and society supports that.
Right.
And because society supports it, and little kids learn that, no one actually gets that jealous about it.
Right. So interesting. Hard to know, but does this evidence of bonobos and chimps mean that we are non-monogamous?
Oh, yeah, well, I'd say sure. From the genetic perspective and stuff like how our bodies function naturally, I would imagine that we are closer to that model of having multiple partners than not.
Do you think we're naturally more like chimps and bonobos than we are like the way we are today in Seattle society?
Naturally, that's where I don't know, because all the culture that we have, all the knowledge we have going back as far back as we know.
But if we had a time machine and looked at ourselves 500,000 years ago when our species was emerging, or say 300,000 years ago when our species was clearly established, would we see behavior that was like today, or would we see behavior that's like bonobos or chimps or something else?
We kind of have a written record of it. We seem to have more behavior like bonobos crossed with chimps in antiquity, where essentially it was a mix of the free-form sexuality, but coupled with the violence the violence and the patriarchy. And over time, society enforced rules that made us more like a peaceful bonobo chimp version with monogamy, but with the peace aspects.
Well, that's within history, right? Because culture emerged well before the written record that we have.
Sure. But then one
because of agriculture, for example.
Right. And it's again, the onus is almost on the other side, because maybe the reason chimps and bonobos are not humans is because their way of organizing wasn't as conducive as the way that humans eventually organized.
Yeah. So the answer to the question is we don't know. There's no way to know, and because this is something that people will do when they're like, look at bonobos, look at chimps, like they're not monogamous, so we're clearly not meant to be monogamous, and it's a compelling argument.
I've made that argument,
and it stands to reason. But
I literally used bonobos in my argument before.
Right, but there's no way to know if that's true because. One, we did not evolve from bonobos and chimps. We evolved from a common ancestor of bonobos and chimps. And we have no idea what that common ancestor was like. I mean, we certainly see a lot of variation between chimps, bonobos, and us.
And we are more successful than either of them.
Well, successful,
by all metrics, right?
Well, by our human decided metrics.
No, by universal metrics, let's say. If there is one metric,
but success doesn't have to do with it. It just has to, in terms of like reproduction. That's
we vast outnumber them. We basically decided their fate. Sadly, we are the most successful mammal in
But
history.
Anyway, the point is that we don't know that just because we could observe them in quote unquote their natural state, which they can actually vary too, depending on their environment. That's an important thing to point out. But for example, bonobos can be actually quite violent and really hurtful to their fellow species when they're troubled. Anyway, who knows what the ancient ancestor was like that we all evolved from, one, in their natural state. Two, there's no way to know that our line on the tree of life didn't evolve into a natural state that was really quite different from the other two. There are certainly a lot of branches on the evolutionary tree where you have 3 species that are very close in cousins, and one species has a completely different set of instincts and behaviors. And so the answer to the question is, it's evidence, that it's worthy. We could look at bonobos and chimps as like, sort of vague evidence that we probably in our natural state were not monogamous at the very least. But it's unknown. We just can't know the answer to that question, because the only way to know the answer to that question is to actually get a time machine and go back in time, and or raise thousands of humans from birth in a biodome and observe them and watch. You probably get 100 different biodomes and you observe over 10 generations the kinds of behaviors that emerge in those groups of people.
Yeah.
Of course, we're not going to do that. We can do that with rats. We can do that with bonobos. We actually do that with other species. And we'll just never know the answer to that question, is the thing. And so we have to be very tentative about looking at bonobos and chimps as evidence of who we are.
Sure.
But what other evidence do we have for promiscuity? So one thing that we've already talked about is humans simply are not very monogamous. Studies, when we look at cultures around the world, one study, what percentage of cultures were the behavior was, tended to be exclusively monogamous?
Well, sorry, but this is sort of loaded, right? Because I feel like we're talking about permanent monogamy here instead of temporary monogamy.
Right. So this is permanent monogamy. So this is where you actually look at the cultures, at the societies.
Yeah.
And from what you can tell, it looks like there's no extramarital relationships.
And this is where, like, we're already kind of sacrificing this huge plot of land, because we're going from 50 times a day during estrus with 12 partners, or constant sex at all various different contexts with babies and adults and everything, to, yeah, I'm mostly monogamous. I've had a few affairs. Those are not in the same realm, right?
Yeah.
So therefore, if the question was, what portion of human populations are mostly monogamous for stretches of time, I'd say the majority. But if the question is, what portion of the human societies are, regularly, like there's affairs or people break up, and then I would say actually that's the majority. You see what I'm saying? Like,
yeah, right.
It depends how you ask the question.
Well, I'm asking the second question.
So sure. Yeah, I'd say that probably what is the statistic? 50% of marriages end in divorce or something. And I'd say probably...
in the United States. We're talking about around the world.
Yeah, sure. And maybe it's less in more traditional societies. So I would say maybe at least 40% of the world reports not being consistently monogamous.
Yeah, and it's not report from what I understand the studies, but it's this one study, and it depends on the definition, depends on the method, but it's 16% is what they found.
16. Oh, okay.
Yeah,
that's much lower.
Particularly those societies that encourage men to be involved in child rearing, like the United States, have more likelihood of being exclusively monogamous, because some societies don't really have a culture that encourages men to be involved that much. But again, it's hard to measure. But when you look at the United States, most people have sex with multiple people in their lifetime. Study 2011, CDC, United States. What percentage of men and women had more than one partner aged, so that when they ask people aged 25 to 44, so these are, your prime sex years, so we say.
Yeah.
What percentage of women had more than one partner, reported having more
25 to 40, more than one partner, women. Percentage, I'd say 70%.
Good, 77.
Yeah.
Men?
87%.
Good, 85. Very close. What about 7 or more percentage?
7 or more partners?
Yeah.
Okay, women would be 50%.
31%.
Okay.
Men?
40%.
49.
Okay.
So now the gap kind of looks weird. It's like 31% of women, 49% of men, probably due to cultural pressures on reporting. It's hard to know.
Yeah.
But at the very least, we see here that the vast majority of people in the United States do not have sex with only one person.
Right. But then a different way to look at that is that over, 30 years, they barely had sex with anyone.
Maybe, but if an alien were to observe us the way that we observe chimps and bonobos, they would say like, "Oh, humans are not monogamous."
I disagree, man. Because imagine if you observed bonobos for 30 years, and mostly they had sex with one or a couple partners, would you really call them? Yeah, they're like polyamorous. No, you'd be like, yeah, they're fairly monogamous.
Well, again, so it depends on the definition.
Yeah.
Are we saying you have sex 100,000 times with one individual, and then one time you have sex with another?
Sure.
Are we calling that monogamous?
Well, but I'm even saying, like, let's say it was like for 3 years they had sex with one person, then they had another relationship for 7 years, then they had another 3-year relationship, and then they've been in the same relationship for 10 years. That to me, sure, it's quote unquote serial monogamy, but as a species, like from an animal level, that feels monogamous to me.
Again, it depends on the definition.
I know, I get it, but we're also talking about lifespans, that humans have way longer lifespans than most animals, and so you can't even compare in many cases,
Yeah, certainly there's
like if a bonobo lived, well, that's still a bad example, but I'm thinking that no question, if the strict definition is no, you literally only had one sexual partner, yeah, by definition, we're not. But
right,
that's not very practical.
Well, okay, so as you're talking, I think that there's a helpful distinction between two general camps of quote unquote monogamy. One is that for some period of time, you tend to prefer to be with one individual,
right?
Whatever that, say a year or 5 years or whatever, some sort of span of time, and that feels, if an alien were to come down and observe, they'd be like, wow, you observe for like a year, they'd be like, wow, 95% of them only had sex with one individual during that span of time. That's a monogamous species, and that is very different from bonobos and chimps.
Right.
And certainly that's what they would see among a lot of humans, for example. Another sort of camp of monogamy is how many people did you have sex with in your lifetime?
Sure.
Regardless of span of time of monogamy. Anyway, so as you said, half of marriages end in divorce. It's actually more complicated than that. I can't remember the exact figures, but it's like half of marriages, but something like only 35 to 40% of first marriages end in divorce.
Oh, interesting.
So
second and third are more commonly
right. So if you get divorced once, your second marriage is much more likely to end in a divorce.
Oh, no.
And third marriages are very likely to end in divorce.
That sucks.
So if you get married your first time, like 2/3-ish chance you'll probably stay together the rest of your life. Yeah. So that seems to, but a lot of marriages end in divorce. This is evidence that we're quote unquote not monogamous. And I'm comparing us to, again, in the animal kingdom, they will look at, for example, gibbons, which are a primate. And for the most part, they tend to mate with one person for their entire life.
Yeah.
There are quote unquote divorces occasionally, but it's not, and they live a while, and it's not serial monogamy. It's not, they don't tend to stray from that. And so anyway, compared to gibbons,
right,
we're not as monogamous as gibbons.
That's a given. But that's a given. But I was going to say the interesting thing about having the stat of like, okay, so one divorce, you're less likely, the first marriage, you're less likely to divorce, but afterwards you're more likely. This made me think of something. The expectation at a society level is that you are going to be monogamous. You're going to be married, not divorced. That's the general expectation, as we've talked about. But at the same time, there is the expectation that you're going to find the right one, right? So like that's how you stay together. So then it's like this crazy demand because, and then on top of that, it's like, and you probably should be a virgin, right? Like, it's like, okay, wait. How the hell am I supposed to find the right one in the first place then? It doesn't make sense. So at a bonobo level, or a given level, I feel like they don't have as much of a choice. It's not like they get to travel, see the world for a bit, go to college, right? No, like they grow up in their little society and that's their partner and they mate and that's the thing. Well, it occurs to me that when humans were less free, marriages probably lasted longer and there were probably less separations.
What do you mean, like 100 years ago?
Yeah, or even longer, right? It was like you didn't have a choice.
Yeah, it's true.
First of all, you met less people.
Right.
You had less distractions. You didn't have porn. You didn't have any other stuff. And you certainly, the church in many cases wasn't even, it was a verboten thing. Now, you may be unhappy. You may fight. It may even be violent. Sucks, right? But you're going to stay together. Mm-hmm. So then I'm wondering, well, then what is our natural state? Because you think, well, now that we're freer, our natural state seems to be more divorce. But you could think, well, then therefore, is our natural state to eat a lot of sugar and get overweight?
Right. That's good. That's a good point.
Yeah.
Because that's a tempting conclusion is, well, we're moving into a freer, more flexible society.
Right.
That is not being, there's not as much controls on our behavior as it was 100 years ago when you had strict laws even, strict religious ideals, strict, stigmas. Women could literally be killed and still can be in some societies if they cheat, for example. So we're heading into a society in which people are flexible and free to be who they want to be.
Right.
Does that mean that, and we're becoming more promiscuous. Right. Does that mean that our natural state is promiscuity? But as you said, maybe our society is actually, because it's not the way our society used to be,
right,
where we get exposed to all the things you mentioned, and we also get exposed to hundreds of thousands of strangers every day.
Yeah.
And so maybe that's what's causing us to be promiscuous.
Right.
And maybe in the olden days, 300,000 years ago, when we came into contact with 100, 200 human beings, and half of them would be the other gender, and
many of them were our relatives,
and many of them were our relatives, or too young or too old or something. Yeah. And what did we look like? Maybe it was like, because I guess when you think about it in that sense, and maybe this is similar for bonobos, I don't know. It's like, well, even if you were the biggest slut in the tribe, it's probably like a dozen people.
You look monogamous.
Yeah, because there just isn't that many people. Yeah. And maybe, this is actually interesting because you brought this up. Maybe our, now that we're free, there's a certain evolutionarily designed instinct that when tribes would bump up against other tribes, which was very rare,
right,
there would be this sort of like, ooh, I want to get me some strange
genes, strange DNA.
Yeah, I want to get some strange here, but it only happened like once every 5 years maybe.
Yeah.
And so the rest of the time you're monogamous, but every once in a while you're like, boom, okay, well, let's shuffle some genes between the other tribes and then let's not see another tribe for another 5 years. Maybe it's like, and since the average human lived to be, 60 years old or something,
right?
Well, not average, but the average adult lived to be about 60, is that you effectively would have sex with one person like 99.9% of the time, and like every now and then you'd have a dalliance. Right. And so it's an interesting question. Again, we have no idea.
No idea.
We just don't know. Like they're all great speculations, and and we just also have to acknowledge that all of our wishes get infused into what data we tend to privilege. Like, there are certain people who like polyamory, for example. There's polyamory advocates, if you will, and they will cherry pick the data. Just look, humans, we're not supposed to be monogamous.
Right.
But the conclusion I have is just like, we just don't know. Like it'd be nice. There seems to be strong evidence.
Yeah.
But we really just do not know.
Yeah.
Now, what we do know is that we can think more flexibly about what is possible for humans. We don't have to say, what we do know is that from the data, there's a lot of different ways to be happy and a lot of different ways to function as a society. Just one detail is like, 50 years ago, 100 years ago, we, as not only an industry in my field of psychology, but also in society, we deemed homosexuality to be deviant.
Right.
It was a disorder. It was against God. It was unnatural. Yeah. It was evidence of something wrong with your brain. In the same way that if we see someone ranting and raving and seeing that they're, I'm Darth Vader on the street, we go like, well, they have a disorder. There's something wrong with their brain. It's so out of the norm and there's no rational reason why that would be happening and it's totally dysfunctional.
Although now we might believe it because since Emperor Palpatine came back, anything is possible.
God damn it. So we deemed it unnatural and thus, a disorder. I can't remember where I was going with that.
That basically we change, because we used to call homosexuality a disorder, and we have, our notions of what is conducive, what's good for us, what is natural,
right? It has changed over time, and so we just have to be mindful of that. Anyway, so the other evidence that we're promiscuous is fantasy, which isn't actually brought up very often.
Interesting.
When you ask people what they fantasize about. Strange is a very common theme.
Sure.
People that they know and just strangers.
Yeah.
People other than their monogamous partner.
Sure.
So yeah.
Hence why porn.
Right. Also, it's not like there's a high demand for porn that involves your spouse.
Send us some of your pictures of your spouse and we'll generate some porn for you.
Right.
That's a business idea.
That certainly happens, but it's in terms of you film your spouse doing something and you masturbate to it later or whatever. But so fantasy is also an interesting sort of line of evidence because we're free to think about whatever we want to, and when we are aroused, it's a physiological response. There's no arguing with the fact that a certain fantasy turns us on, and if we frequently think about people that aren't our monogamous partner, then maybe it's supposed to be how we're really supposed to be.
That's the perfect argument for why we are monogamous by nature, because we developed through evolution the ability to fantasize about others without having to do stuff with others.
I like this. That's the debate. It's like both stories can be true. No way to test for it. That's the point. We have no way to test which one is true. And that's what I want everyone to understand as we go through this is like whatever you've learned about, the debate, are we naturally monogamous or not, is that people, philosophers included, they'll start pointing to data, but it's like, well, we just don't know. There's no way to test if that's true. Just because it feels right to you doesn't mean it is, supported by the data.
And again, it goes back to, and by the way, I'm not actually taking sides here. I'm just kind of enjoying pointing the inconsistencies no matter which way you cut it. Because the whole thing about what feels natural in our head or whatever, again, take some morphine and then ask yourself if it feels natural that you want more morphine.
Right.
And what that means. And so like, sure, there's lots of things we desire, lots of things that are genetically programmed for us to want.
Right.
And then still we have to make conclusions about, is that what we should do? Is that what's best for us?
Right.
Is that what,
maybe a more down-to-earth example is eating Doritos is, feels natural. But I think most of us can agree that, and good, I think most of us agree that you shouldn't be eating Doritos only.
Those radioactive looking, super cheesy triangles look natural to you.
The other data here that we are promiscuous naturally is that humans cheat a lot, even though there are many consequences against it. Cheating is one of the most destructive things that we can do. All of us can agree about that. And I've talked with a lot of people who have cheated, and everyone is busted up about it. I mean, even people who do it frequently, when you actually ask them to reflect on it, they don't want to cheat. They wish they could have cheating isn't the goal. The goal is to, I don't know what the goal is particularly. There's a lot of reasons why people cheat. But anyway, and this is true in all societies. So if we look at in the United States, affairs over the course of a marriage, this is self-report, remember, because you can't measure this empirically. But when you ask men over the course of a particular marriage, and this is actually a stat that I came across that I liked, because a lot of the stats, they'd be like, when you ask men and women how often they cheat, it's just like lifetime.
Yeah.
Which isn't very interesting, because think about all of us when we were like 16, like 20, cheat, most people have some event in their life that could be categorized as cheating.
Like, how much in a relationship are you at some point?
So this study looked at a marriage, and over the course of a marriage, what's the percentage of men who report a cheating event?
Okay, 60.
Estimates from 30 to 60%.
Wow.
Women,
40.
20 to 50%.
Okay.
So estimates even range further from that, by the way. A problem with this, it seems like it'd be a relatively easy thing to study, but there's a problem, because what do you call a situation where you're in the beginning of your relationship, like you just started dating, this was like 15 years ago, and you had a commitment, but it was the beginning of the relationship, and you got together with an ex. A lot of people will be like, I didn't really consider that cheating because it was so long ago as the beginning of a relationship. In fact, me and my spouse, we broke up 3 years after that, and we got back together. So I kind of reset the clock at that point. Or people going online and masturbating with another person over webcam or whatever. Some people consider that cheating, some people don't. So,
or participating in an orgy, which is not at all cheating.
For example, infidelity over a single year, men and women. So you just ask people, this last year, this last 12 months, have you cheated?
Have you cheated?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to go 20% for men.
No, lower.
Okay, good. I mean, that's good.
Yeah.
5%.
5%.
Okay.
What about women?
4%.
5%.
Okay.
So this is evidence that, again, with all the pressures to not do this, we still see
a minority
in each year, but looks like most
a majority
people
over a relationship
have extra relationships. Now, again, when we, under the definition that most anthropologists will look at when they're looking at a species, is they will say, or people who study animals, they will look at, for example, a primate and see, okay, well, there's some pair bonding, but in any given span of time, there's a pretty high likelihood that one of them will have sex with someone outside of that. So they will categorize that as not monogamous, because gibbons,
which is crazy.
But it's just
I know
you
it's
keep
just
saying
a
that, but you understand it's just
not very useful. Is
it's
what
like
I'm saying.
I don't want to call curtains curtains. You
okay,
know?
but here's my example. Do humans follow laws?
Yeah.
Do you break a law ever?
Yeah.
I break laws all the time.
Yeah.
So we don't follow laws. Humans don't follow laws. Humans are naturally not a species that follows laws.
Well, no, to be specific to your analogy, we would have two categories of people. We would call them law-abiding people.
Who never break a law.
Right. And we call people...
But that's not useful.
Right. So we have to be specific.
Right. I fine. And if you're being specific,
so
I will look at your paper.
The word monogamy, unless you define it early in your argument, is not a useful word because you don't know what they're referring to.
And it's important to do that, because if I look at your paper and you're being specific, now I know that I can throw your paper in the garbage.
All right. So we haven't talked about hunter-gatherer societies yet.
Right.
So let's do that. So hunter-gatherer societies, what do you think? Are they usually promiscuous or monogamous or polygamous or whatever? What do we usually see?
Okay, with hunter-gatherers, they tended...
Current.
Oh, current?
There are current hunter-gatherers.
Sure. I'm probably going to still think the same way. So you have to move around because seasonality, animals move around. So you're a nomad. And because of that, you have to have some way to establish kind of tribal security as you're moving around. But you have to be flexible. So I'm going to go less monogamy.
than we see in our society, like in
Yes.
Seattle.
Yes.
That's true.
Okay.
It depends on the hunter-gatherer society, but as a whole, on average, they're usually a lot more promiscuous than us.
And part of the reason is like it has to sustain itself. If you are a society that is going to be like, no, you can't look at her. No, dude, but we're having, like, there's only 10 of us and we have to move around successfully. You know, it just doesn't seem, plus you got to reproduce and have successful reproduction. And also you're also a closer knit group. So there's this societal upbringing of kids. So the monogamy part is not as useful for the upbringing of the kids. And
so the speculation that Christopher Ryan actually proposed in his book, Sex at Dawn, which we'll get into a little bit later, but in a nutshell, is that hunter-gatherers were the way we all were. That's pretty undisputed in the olden days. And only some of us are today. And so when we look at that, we're like, okay, why are there differences in not only sexual behavior, but in attitudes?
yeah.
Well, hunter-gatherer societies tend to, like bonobos, not really care about resources because it's abundant. Now, we have this bias that like hunter-gatherers had it hard and agriculture made it easier because you get to grow your food. You don't have to go look for it. But that's a bias because we are an agricultural, culture, and we don't know how to hunt and gather anymore. But hunting and gathering with, especially when you consider low population volume in a particular region,
Right.
And nomadic lifestyle, imagine it's just essentially what it was like is like your tribe was like, oh, we kind of dried up this grocery store.
Yeah.
Let's just, walk a mile down the river.
Right.
Boom, a whole other grocery store just sitting there with just food just growing on the trees in the, the ground, deer to shoot with your bow and arrow, blah, blah. And so
the difficulties are just different, right? In fact, one could argue that you probably just keep doing that indefinitely until one day you're like, oh crap, the new grocery store is not replenished. What are we going to do next season?
Well, but at a certain population density, by the time you get back to whatever region or region that someone else has been, everything's grown back.
Right, but then someone's like, well, you know how we've been seeing less resources? I've got an idea. We can kind of plant some of these resources.
Right.
And then that becomes more convenient for a bit, but it's a lot of work, but in a different kind of way.
Right.
You can keep your settlements.
Right. So there's certain convenience to it for sure. And it allows for population growth in a way that you can't do with hunting and gathering. But hunter-gatherer societies, there's abundant resources and you don't have to work very long.
Yeah.
Again, that's another misconception that like, well, you must have to work like 24/7.
Hunt all day long.
But that's actually the opposite. Yeah. Agriculture work requires a lot more hours toiling.
Every day.
Than it does
Constant.
hunting and gathering. Imagine it's like you just walk, I don't know, like half a mile in one direction, and there's an apple tree. Yeah. There's some proto carrots growing out of the ground. There's like a couple rabbits that you kill, and then boom, you got your day's worth of calories. Right. And you just did like an hour's worth of work. You know?
This is the meta story in the Old Testament is all about this, right? Like they were hunter-gatherers, no care in the world, and then all of a sudden they screw up and they're like, okay, now you got to work for it.
Right. Yeah, well, actually, that's interesting. One could say that the tree of knowledge and the apple was agriculture.
Yeah.
Now you've got to, blah, blah. Anyway, so then... and so you don't have to, by extension, you don't have to own anything.
Right.
You don't have to own land because you can't own that. You also don't have to hoard your food. You don't have to. You don't have to own your food.
So that whole thing we were talking about, the jealousy instinct and stuff.
Right.
Maybe you don't need as much of that, right? It's like, oh, they're getting to hunt. Oh wait, I am too. But they're getting to. Oh wait, I am also getting to eat.
There's that in these societies. One of the phrases that will be of value is the richest. I can't remember the phrase, but it's like the richest man is the man who shares his resources because you garner all these favors, cooperation. When you are sick and you can't hunt, you get to repay. Everyone wins when you give. The safest place to store your food for the winter is someone else's stomach.
Oh, right. Bird in hand is like the stone that gathers no agriculture.
Right. So because you have a psychology and a society oriented towards sharing and resource abundance and cooperation, it extends into sexuality.
Yeah.
In that you don't have to own your woman or your man.
Right.
Not even necessarily your kids. Because if you're gonna take care of all the kids in the village, well, then other people will take care of your kids by extension.
Right.
And so you don't need to even know if they're your kids. So you don't need to make sure that that the women don't have sex with other people, because it doesn't matter.
Yeah, it's more like a worker bee. And I don't mean this dismissively. I just mean like a worker bee is not worried about their specific genetic offspring. They care about the hive. Mm-hmm. And so like in this case, it's like, well, yeah, I mean, our tribe's important.
Right.
Us staying together and surviving, that's important.
Right. And so as we head into agriculture, we headed into this society, and again, this is, strong speculation.
Sure.
Or sort of believable speculation in a certain crowd of people, is that we went to agriculture. Now we have land that is yours, because you can't, and because it's hard to grow enough food for you for the entire year, because you're not, moving around. And resources are actually not very abundant in terms of agriculture in the beginning. You had to work really hard to get just enough food, which is like, why did we decide to go that direction? But anyway, and now you've got to start hoarding. And now you need people to work your fields, which is your kids. And when you die, who gets the land? You can't just give it to all of them, because it'll just be, further subdivided into, only one person can get the farm. The rest of them have to fuck off, and figure out something else. Plus there's decisions that have to be made, about us. So you need one person. Well, at some point there's like, well, the taller person, the father, because in hunter-gatherer societies, they're not particularly, patriarchal.
Yeah.
And so the father now becomes the one owner of this land.
Yeah.
And by extension, the owner of everything on it, including the human beings on it.
And because the protection is now so physical of that land, men are advantaged.
Right. Yeah. So society, since men have power, they can vote, they can kill their wife if they want to. Whereas hunter-gatherer societies, that wouldn't make any sense. It's like, don't kill her. Like, she's a part of we need her. She's a part of our hunting and gathering labor. Yeah. She's also part of our child rearing and protection. She's also part of our social circle. Like, she has value. Whereas in a agricultural society, the woman, her only value is pumping out labor.
Yeah.
And so you can replace that. It's and with the certain, so then we start to develop jealousy, and ownership and anger and war over territory, and everything we have today.
So another example there, so the Abel character in Cain and Abel was a hunter and a shepherd.
You keep bringing up these examples, and they're actually pretty astute, to point out. It's just like, because it's a speculation that early Old Testament stories, they were passed down, eventually written down.
Yeah. Genesis,
early books in the Old Testament, and you got to wonder, like, was there some legacy knowledge of that earlier time pre-agriculture that people still passed down, because it actually wasn't that far, because agriculture is something like 10,000 years ago. And Genesis as a story,
set of stories like was 5,000.
Yeah, something like that. You know what I mean? So it wouldn't have been that much of a stretch.
Yeah.
Plus, agriculture wouldn't have happened to everyone all at once. It could have been like slow.
Right. And especially considering that by our modern standards, 1,000 years is a ridiculous amount of time.
Right.
But when you're not really tracking time, it's more like you're learning through word of mouth what the tribe is telling you. And just you grow up and you impart that same verbatim word of mouth. Generations go by. And you don't care how many generations have gone by. That's the knowledge you have. Right. And it's very possible that that sort of communal gestalt was, at some point it was kind of the good old days, right? Like, sort of wish we still had more berries around here. And then over the generations, it becomes, there was this man or this beast or this thing. And eventually it's like this God and this thing and the other stuff.
Yeah, I mean, we're not the first to speculate this.
Right, of course not. No, I've heard this a billion times.
Yeah.
I'm just saying, like, it's very interesting that.
But I'm just saying it's a very worthy speculation. I just don't want to claim. I just don't want to claim it as ours.
Oh no, definitely.
Okay, so getting back to hunter-gatherer societies in terms of my notes here. So when we observe them, they almost always allow for more than one spouse, either, a woman having several men or a man having several women. Also, female extramarital sexual relationships are much more common and much more accepted. So when women have sex outside of the pair bond, it's not seen as necessarily a bad thing, and it's done more often.
Right.
Also, and here's an interesting finding, was that there's variation among hunter-gatherer societies, and as on a spectrum where you have on one side females having a lot of extramarital relationships, and at the other spectrum, at the other end, you have females not having a lot of extramarital. Which side is more aggressive, do you think?
Oh yeah, so
male aggression of the males along that spectrum.
Right. Well, I would imagine that if the females, let me put it this way: the more the control is on the female side, the less male aggression.
Right. So it's hard to know exactly the vector of cause, but they observe that when women are having more extra pair bonding relationships, sexual relationships, you see less male aggression, similar to bonobos.
Which is and I don't want to, anyways, I won't caveat anything because I think it's obvious where I would stand on this, but I think a lot of the incel community rallies around these concepts. It says, you see, if they just throw sex our way, things would be so much easier. And we wouldn't have to be so violent and aggressive.
Well, they're not wrong, but it doesn't justify,
of course,
bad behavior.
Of course.
And in these societies, the women don't throw sex.
Right.
They allow for social relationships to build where the sex is natural.
Yeah.
For example, around the world, there is a Mosuo culture in southern China. Men and women are allowed to have sex with, whoever they want, in general, more so than we are, in Seattle do. And jealousy is a lot less present, and it's actually culturally frowned upon.
Oh.
So when a woman has sex with another man outside of marriage, because they do have marriage in this culture, and the male's like, hey, people around them are like,
hey, what?
Yeah, calm down.
Calm down, dude.
Your wife had sex with another man. Grow up.
You cuck.
Native cultures in South America, there's some native cultures in South America, women are allowed to have more sex with other people, and there's more uncertainty regarding who the father is.
Don't I know it?
And culture allows for multiple quote-unquote fathers. So in these societies, it's like men don't necessarily know who the father is. They're like, well, one of the five of us are the father of that kid. And so we're all going to call each other the father because they don't have paternity tests, right? So they, and there's probably less variation in terms of morphology to identify like, well, you look like that dad. And so
let me just say there are tribes of little Humberticos running around in the Andes Mountains as we speak.
Because you are part native South America.
Right.
Maybe that's the part of you. Okay, so like bonobos, most of our sexual activity is not for reproduction. I have this in my notes. If we were basically saying this before, but if aliens observed our behavior the way we observe other animals, they would conclude that sex for us was clearly for pleasure and or for bonding 99.9% of the time.
Like they'd actually might be like, wait, how do they reproduce?
Right. So in the U.S., adult humans, my back of the napkin estimate, they have sex about 3,000 times in their lifetime on average. It's something like that.
What about the front of the napkin?
And missionary napkin. And average, how many kids per couple?
2.5.
It's something like 2-ish. 2.5. What percentage of the time was sex for reproduction then?
Well, you said 3,000. How many years are we talking? I mean, whatever. I'm just going to say like 2%.
0.05.
Yeah.
So basically, virtually never.
Virtually never.
Sex in the United States is virtually never for reproduction. Now, some people, it might take them 30 times to get pregnant, maybe more, but on average, okay. Now, but you're like, well, hey, we have contraception now. But before you had contraception, the numbers wouldn't have been that different. You still probably had sex maybe even more than 3,000 times because there wasn't a lot to do at night. And you had maybe 10 children.
And a functionalist might argue, wait. You wouldn't have had the second child if you hadn't kept having non-reproductive sex.
Yeah, and that's all fine. This is all back of the napkin stuff. Yeah. But clearly, we wouldn't say that in the olden days people had sex 10 times and had 10 kids. Right. Like, if plus our species, we don't go into heat like other animals do. So there's no way there's very little indication that a woman is in estrus. There are some indications, but very little. And so, whereas you look at other species and it's extremely obvious, like their rump becomes bright red and so big that they have to walk hunched over and ready to go. You know what I mean? Whereas humans, it's like there's slight pheromones and little smells and little behavior changes,
and the mole things.
Yeah.
But it is true that it used to be, because there was no contraception, it used to be more common where people would have, 15 children. And, just because it takes 9 months to give birth, that's 17 years, Nearly 20 years worth of every time we had sex, we basically got pregnant.
Right. Well, every time we could have sex.
Every time we could have sex and get pregnant, we got pregnant.
We had sex enough times to get pregnant because you'd have to have sex randomly.
Yeah, sure.
So the other thing here is that a lot of human sexual activity doesn't involve penis and vagina.
No.
So you have, oral and same sex activity, heavy petting, masturbation. A lot of human sexual activity is not possible to reproduce from, and people enjoy all those other forms of sexual activity.
Again, the contrarian might point out, I know, but you can't get to the reproduction one without the foreplay one.
But a lot of people, quote unquote, only do foreplay
for a few years until they reproduce.
One could argue that lesbian sex is all quote unquote foreplay. Do you understand? But it's not foreplay. It's the play. So, a study by Meston and Buss, 2007, found that there were 237 reasons why humans have sex. What are some of them?
They're hungry.
No,
they're bored. They're in close proximity. They're under stressful situations.
Okay.
They are upset at each other. They're happy with each other. They're related to each other. They're not really. I don't know.
I like you're not getting any of the main ones.
Well, they find each other attractive and they just met.
Okay.
They are in love with each other.
Yeah. I'm surprised it took you that long.
Like 237, they'll probably throw they smelled like
But
fish.
I'm just saying, you brought all the dregs and not because they love each other. How about that one?
Sure.
Okay. So to be systematic, I'll give the list of the main sort of categories. To feel love, to express love, to bond, to feel commitment. Self-esteem boost. Or because of duty, or because of pressure, or mate guarding, or stress reduction, as you said, pleasure, to feel desirable, experience seeking, social status, revenge, and reproduction, and many more. So for humans and bonobos, sex clearly evolved as a communication of some sort. How much, how often, but sex is a way that we communicate to other people.
Yeah.
Revenge, that I love you, that I'm dedicated to you. When my dog feels insecure, he gives me a worried face. He puts his tail down. He whines.
Yeah.
All dogs do this for the most part. For a human or a bonobo, when they become insecure, one of the instincts is to seek sex with, particularly, I guess, your romantic partner, as a way of communicating, look, I'm a little insecure. Can you reassure me? So we all can understand that. And again, how much of it is an instinct? How often did we do that in comparison to other signaling to other people for reassurance? It's hard to know, but we clearly have that in our background, because otherwise we wouldn't probably exhibit it at all. You know what I mean?
Right. And at the same time, I wonder, so imagine if, again, the aliens, right? And they start jotting down their notes and they're like, okay, I think I've got a conclusion. Humans have clearly evolved to use their index finger to rapidly tap on a little kind of dark cube or rectangle, and while they're staring at photons flashing in front of their light.
I thought this was sexual until I thought it was like, clitorises aren't cube. They're not a cube shape. What are you talking about?
No, but
and they're not necessarily dark.
The aliens are like realizing, okay, humans evolved to tap on things while they're looking at photons that are irradiating really quickly in front of their eyes.
So to be clear, Berto's talking about a mouse of a computer
and a video game.
Yeah.
And well, no, we evolved for pleasure, kind of seeking reward, because that might mean it's good food that we're eating, or we're breathing fresh oxygen, or we got clean in a nice river. And so we evolved this kind of pleasure reward cycle. And then it turns out that we also evolved to look at colors and be like, that might be interesting fruit, and ooh, that might be a predator. So now all of a sudden we're flashing these things and it's rewarding us. We're kind of hijacking those original systems. So similarly, in a modern...
And to be clear, there's nothing in the natural history of our species that looks anything like playing a video game.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But in the modern world, where we're like, we have the same hormonal triggers to feel like, ooh, I feel I need to reproduce. But then it's like, well, I don't have to reproduce, it turns out, because I got this little plastic thing I can put on. Plus, I've got this little porn I can watch. Plus, all of a sudden, the need is still there, because ultimately the species is trying to reproduce. But the outlet looks like all sorts of different things.
Well, so I want to also point out that the experts will say that we evolved clearly a instinct and a need to reproduce, just like any other species that reproduces through sex. So that's clear. But like bonobos, we also evolved and adopted sex as a way of socializing.
Right.
That seems to be clear as well. And so in the same way that when our social instincts adopted things that were useful. So for example, for a non-social lizard, they, like all other animals, have a pain response. And so if they were to be on a hot plate or you were to stab their tail, they would feel pain and they would wince and they would run. There would be a pain receptor that tells the brain that hurt. There would be an automatic reaction to pull away, and then there would be an evaluation like get away from that source of pain. So, most, if not all, animals have that in our neuronal, instincts and psychology, and we're born with that. Right out of the womb, we can feel pain. Well, we didn't come from species back in the day that had a different system of motive. So that's a system of motivation.
Yep.
So you have pain and it motivates you to get away from the pain. You need to have a negative experience and then it motivates you to get away from that pain. Okay. So we didn't evolve from a species that had a whole other set of motivation mechanisms that had a different set for socializing. So as we started to develop into a social species, primates and other mammals, we adopted that pain response as a way of motivating us to socialize. And so when we were hurt or rejected or left alone or someone dies, we actually feel that pain. That's why our heart breaks. That's why we feel that sort of hard, sort of like a stab in the heart. We'll be like, oh, that person stabbed me in the back. And there's all these metaphors, and it's not a metaphor. We feel physical pain, whether it registers consciously or not. There's a physical pain, and then we're like, oh my God, this hurts so much, and you're crying, and you're like, oh, cringeworthy. That's why when we're watching...
The brain's like simulating
Right.
physical pain for
We're
you.
simulating being stabbed or being poked at by a bear or something.
Right.
And so it makes us motivate us to avoid that. So in the same way, we also had sex,
Right.
that was for reproduction. And it seems that other species that are not social would feel pleasure when they have sex.
Right.
There's a motivation. If the same way that fish and salmon probably get a little shot of pleasure hormones in their brain when they eat something
Yes.
that they like, they probably have the same thing when they spoo on top of a pile of eggs.
That's right.
We don't know that for sure,
Yeah.
but the prop stands to reason. There's a pleasure, like go over there and mate with that other creature because it's going to feel good, and it's not going to feel bad, and so we had that mechanism which made sense. But then as we became social, it's like, well, we can motivate people away from rejecting the tribe by we'll give them physical pain. Well, how do we motivate? This is again evolution, adopting things and random chance. But eventually, evolution went in this direction where it's like, well, for those people who who have an urge when they want to bond for the purpose of being together all the time so that you can protect your child and share resources and maybe even have sex with people in your tribe to kind of smooth things over. We develop this instinct. It's just like, I want to have sex with that person.
Right.
I want to have sex with that person. I want to have sex with that same sex person because even though it's not reproduction, this is not conscious. This is unconscious.
Yeah, totally.
It's just like we get selected for this urge to have sex with a lot of people, even though most of the time it has nothing to do with reproduction.
Yes.
Did I make any sense?
Yes, you did.
Okay.
Because sex was the original video game. So like now this is happening with more abstract ways, right? Like for example, people socialize with video games. People, they retreat into a video game. They feel socially awkward, so they go play a video game. They feel like they want to meet up with their friends online and things like that. But they're still just rewarding, dopamine reward. Dopamine
Interesting.
reward,
So that also, I guess what I would say is that, we originally 50 years ago, we socialized in person.
Right.
And then we developed this thing called a video game.
Yeah.
And at first it was to do in isolation, to do by yourself or something. But then eventually we started using video games to socialize.
Right.
Even though its original design was not to socialize.
Yeah.
It was something you did by yourself.
Yeah, it's just an individual challenge.
But we still have a need to socialize, and so it just becomes adopted into that way of communicating. And so the same way that sex did. Okay. So there's other evidence. There's a lot of evidence, and these are things that we've heard on the internet as well, there's evidence that females were promiscuous, and this is a subset of the evidence that humans are promiscuous. So do you know the different evidence, so to speak, that females in particular were promiscuous?
Nope.
Well, when I say them, you'll remember them.
Okay.
So
what time frame? Like fossil record time?
like 300,000 years ago.
Yeah, okay.
Like there are certain parts of our anatomy that will tell us. Anyway, so, but before I go into the evidence, I'll say why do you think it would benefit if a species had females that were promiscuous?
Well, I mean, in our case, like the because the females have such few options, human females have such few options for the reproduction happening successfully, you would think it would be to their advantage to try with more mates.
Right. Right. So it increases the odds of getting pregnant.
Yeah.
Also, potential paternal care from multiple males.
Yeah.
So if three males think they're the father, then you're more likely to get more.
Three.
Yeah.
What do you call child support payments?
Right. It also avoids inbreeding within the tribe because you get. It's more likely that inbred children will survive. And blah, blah, blah. It also strengthens social bonds, and you're better able to evaluate male quality through experience. So if you have sex with only one man, then you don't know, is this the good man in the tribe or is this the bad man in the tribe? Right. Okay, so those are the benefits to it. And we talked about earlier, the hunter-gatherers seem to, when you have sex more promiscuous sex, people tend to like each other more, and they tend to be less competitive with each other, and they tend to cooperate more. But anyway, so one of the interesting things about humans and other primates is that when females and males are having sex, they will vocalize. So it just, we all know that, from at least porn.
I go, Gucci, Gucci, Gucci!
That there's a compulsion to make vocalizations while you're having sex. And to us, it just seems like, well, it's just something that humans do, but, other animals will do it too. Why? Why would we evolve an instinct to announce something's happening? When we drink water, we don't go like, I'm drinking water, or blah, 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 or when you decide to go to sleep, you don't go like, ha, 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 sleep time, I mean, I guess some people do, but, in terms of animal behavior. Why do you think humans and other primates would have the females and maybe the males make noise and announce to everyone around them that they're having sex?
Oh, okay, I see, because I was initially thinking of just like the couple, but you're thinking, well, in a society...
Or other,
Sure.
do both.
Okay, so in the couple case, that might indicate, hey, this is working.
Good. So
right?
That's absolutely a speculation.
Yeah. And then in the more like you're communally, like you're doing it, but others are there listening or whatever, that might be like, hey, FYI, everyone, like we're busy here. So don't like bother us. Don't hit us. Don't knock us over.
Good. So your speculation is human centric and cultural centric because it exhibits the bias towards monogamy, essentially, at least for that moment, right? Because it makes sense. It's like, but the experts, what they'll say is that vocalizations is evidence of what chimps do, which is when a female is in estrus, she has sex with several males.
Right.
And the vocalizations announce open for business.
Sure.
Let's go. Like,
hey, FYI, I'm having fun here. Anyone else?
Right. Open for business, dudes. If you want to get in on this, like now's the time.
Running a 2-for-1 special.
Right.
Now, okay, fair enough. Yeah, I could see that. Because I was thinking about it more from the perspective of hey, this is working as in this might lead to conception, as opposed to, you can imagine if like if it's not really in the right hole, or if it's not working or something, like it's not pleasurable, and so it's like, this is not working. We might not get pregnant.
Yeah. And that absolutely could be. Like you're just trying to communicate to the person you're having sex with.
Yeah.
Now, when they actually look at other primates, they find that the primates with louder vocalizations don't necessarily have more partners. So it's not really clear. If so
too much advertisement. Hey, hey, look at me!
God, I'm just trying to play checkers over here. Like, give me a break.
You just vocalized earlier.
But it is interesting. Some people will point to this as evidence. It's hard to know. Also, female sex fantasies, often humans, often involve group sex and even rape.
Right.
So that seems to be evidence that we evolved as a species to prefer, or a certain amount of women who prefer there to be multiple males and dominant males. The rape fantasies, in essence, are not rape fantasies. Very few people have fantasies about actual rape. Most of the rape fantasies involve like a very persistent male who very much wants to have sex with you.
The 50 Shades of Grey kind of rape.
Right. And they don't wait for consent, but you basically do consent deep down. That's usually what the fantasy involves.
The James Bond kind of rape.
Right. And it's hard to know which category that's in, because there's some scenes in James Bond where it's just like, nope, that was just rape. Like there's a scene in Majesty with Love, or what the one with that
Her Majesty's Secret Service.
No, maybe is that the one with George
Lazenby?
Yeah, there's a scene George Lazenby just grabs, or no, what am I thinking? Anyway, Goldfinger, can't remember which one it was, but so now this is evidence maybe that since this turns women on, that stands to reason maybe that's a echo from the past in terms of the sort of thing that women 200,000 years ago actually sought. And it would make sense that if they did seek it, that they would fantasize about it today. Maybe, hard to know. Also, another evidence
Or
that
brutally, that since women were raped and brutalized for hundreds of thousands of years, genetically their offspring were...
well, right, it would have selected for females that were at least like, in their mind, they'd be like, well, okay, I'll go along with this. But there doesn't seem to be evidence of that, because that's the common thing that they will point to. It's like they'll point to harems and polygamy as like, oh, we must have been like gorillas in the past, whereas one strong male and several females, and the consent of sex, probably wasn't. It's a very common trope, especially 40 years ago, where you had a guy who would bonk the woman over the head, drag her back to the cave, and rape her essentially. And but when we look at hunter-gatherer societies, which are probably analogous to the way we were, it's the opposite. We tend to look through to history with our lens, our bias and lens. They're like, well, men are powerful. They like to be masculine. But actually, in the past, cavemen were less "quote unquote" masculine in terms of our society today than we are.
Sure.
We're more caveman-like in terms of the stereotype than cavemen were.
Yeah. Possibly. It could be that for 50,000 years, it's been agriculturally based,
But the hunter-gatherers today who descended from non-agricultural societies tend to exhibit way more non-masculine traits.
Yeah.
Again, hard to know. Like you said, we don't know because we don't have a time machine. Many women can have multiple orgasms and don't experience a refractory period. So this is evidence that, for some, that women were promiscuous, in that, men tend to have one orgasm and tend to have a refractory period of, 30 to
6 months,
30 to 60 minutes or something. And also men tend...
It's funny too, basically. I could see this, like they all line up, they have sex, the man comes and falls asleep. So now he's not aggressive or fighting with the other men. The next one goes, falls asleep. And so at the end, all the men are asleep. The woman's still like, okay, next.
Right. I mean, in essence, that's the hypothesis.
Right.
We don't know. But the hypothesis is like, well, women have an easier time with orgasming and keeping going, whereas men don't. And so that in terms of one model you look at, it's like that's 10 men to one woman in one session.
It fits the chimp model.
Yeah. Also, penis size. So what do you know about penis size and the speculation as to our relative monogamy or not?
I don't know. Oh, wait. So humans
gorillas
have larger penises than other primates proportionally, let's say.
Well, like gorillas have small penises.
Right. So I think the buffer you are, the less you need to have a large penis is the point.
and why? I mean, that is partially related.
The gorilla doesn't have to compete. The silverback competes physically.
Right.
And if they're the toughest in the playground, they get the females.
Right.
Period.
So the gorilla, the way that they operate sexually is that the dominant, in largeness and muscliness has something to do with dominance, will basically just get a few females, and if anyone comes around, he kicks their ass.
Right.
So he has exclusive sexual rights, so to speak, with the females under his reign. So his penis doesn't have to be big. And so we're always trying to optimize our resource expenditure because if there's no need to have a big penis, you don't want to waste resources making a big penis.
But there was a different hypothesis or something I had heard, because why do horses have huge dicks? It's because they need No, but it's because physiologically, they just can't get a small penis in to a female horse the way they fuck. Because one big beast gets on top of the other, you just got to reach all the way in and stuff like that. Humans have long ass legs and very different ways to copulate, and so it's harder. But gorillas have short little legs and all these kind of things.
Yeah, good. And we, if we were like gorillas, we could get by with much smaller penises. It would not be
But you see my point with the horses. Like horses with small penises couldn't reproduce.
Right, but we are physiologically extremely close to gorillas. One, we can have sex from behind the way that...
Like the horses do.
Right, and the way gorillas do.
Yeah, but the difference is in the length of the legs.
Right, but you get my point that we're physiologically, we can get by with small penises and still impregnate people.
Yeah, but it's
horses
harder.
can't be.
It's harder.
But if you own the female, so to speak, the way a gorilla does, and you don't impregnate on the first try, you get to have sex with that female over and over and over again, so you don't need to waste resources on longer penises.
Okay.
So the speculation, and when you look at other species, because we're not, gorillas and horses and humans aren't the only measure, you look at lots of different species, and longer penises are associated with more promiscuous females because you're competing to get your sperm closer than the next guy.
Sure.
And so there's this arms race of you have a selection for bigger and bigger penises, because it makes sense, right? Hard to know, but also there's some pretty good evidence there. Because if we had very small penises, like gorillas, compared to our body size and all that kind of stuff, then that would,
I still think this is the same thing I'm saying, because take my path here, because the goal is like they're trying to get pregnant, right? Physiologically, they're trying to get pregnant, and they're like having sex with these dudes, and that dude kind of put it in, but like it didn't go in very far, so the sperm didn't get very far. The other one, it went in further. So I see what you're saying, which is
but why would gorillas have small penises? Gorillas have a penis about the size of our pinky.
Yeah.
And gorillas are gigantic compared to us. Compared to their body size, they have like the size of like.
And what I'm saying is that.
So why would they have small penises?
Because they don't fail at reproduction. That physiology does not prevent them.
Yeah.
Now your point is that because they get to try more,
right?
And that could be.
That is why they can try more often, and there's no competition or very little competition. That's why they have smaller penises.
I just figured like, yeah, I guess so. I just figured
physiology has very little. There are lots of different penises in the animal kingdom, and they almost always reflect some kind of selection, like duck penises, for example.
Yeah,
there's an arms race between the female quote unquote vagina. They don't call it the vagina, and where the sperm goes, and the male penis. And they have these bizarre penises. If you ever want to watch a YouTube video, if you haven't seen, about the duck penis. It looks like it's almost as long as the duck is, maybe longer. And it's shaped like this alien feathery thing that it's not one direction. It's like several things, because from what I understand, male ducks are routinely essentially raping the female ducks, and the female duck, because they are frequently overpowered effectively by the males, their only defense against, because it makes sense that the female would want to would be selected for choice in terms of like, okay, that male is a good male to allow me to impregnate me. They have all these dead ends in their quote unquote vagina. And their vagina is very long. And so so there's this arms race, and so the shape of the phallus of the penis reflects that behavioral pattern. And so with longer penises among primates, we see all of our primate cousins that have longer penises. It tends to be, if not universally, I'm not quite sure, associated with promiscuous females.
Okay. I find it odd that the body shape would play no role, because
it does play a role.
You know what I mean?
It does play a role. Like, for example, there are other animals that have penises that are basically, you can't even see them.
Right.
Because the physiology allows for there to be transfer of sperm without, so the gorilla has a penis that has to be long enough, it's not longer than it needs to be. That's the whole thing.
Yeah, I guess the way I was thinking about it is, if you think of like a male and a female standing up and then trying to have sex like doggy style, right? If their legs don't align, like the penis has to be longer.
But you're thinking about sex that you like. So all you have to do is get sperm into the vagina. It doesn't have to be satisfactory in terms of in your head. You know what I mean?
No, I'm not talking about pleasure. I'm talking about successful insemination, right?
So you can successfully impregnate a woman, even though
it's harder, maybe.
But if you had multiple chances, you know what I mean? Plus, the reason why the vagina is longer is because the penis has elongated, they elongate it together, you know what I mean? And so if humans had small penises, the vagina would be much shorter and the uterus would be much closer to the entrance.
See, this is where you would have to be making my point, because why would it get longer if it didn't have to?
Because of competition between males.
But the competition is...
So let me walk you through it. So you have 10 males having sex with the same female.
Right.
And this is back in the days when our penises were half as long.
Sure.
It was probably even a distant relative to chimps and bonobos.
Right.
You know? So you have 10 males having sex with the same female. And they have sex within the same, half an hour period of time. I don't know,
right.
Whatever. And each of the males has a different penis size, ranging from, X to Y.
Right.
Y being the higher one. Well, the penises at the Y end of the spectrum are slightly at an advantage in terms of impregnating the female. So the next generation of males all have penises that are between at the higher end of that spectrum. And so there's this new spectrum and new variation of penis sizes that the bell curve has now gone up the scale in terms of length. And now the vagina gets longer because it needs to, sort of move away from the sign from the. I've never had this conversation before, so the words are. But for those, and again, biologists would have a problem with this language.
This is you don't like conclusions about cause and effect with genetics and psychology. And this is what I'm saying is, like, you can't prove the chicken or the egg here. It could be that as our body started elongating, we started walking upright, the uterus started moving up in the body, and that necessitated longer penises to be able to make it all the way in.
I'm not saying that's wrong.
Right?
It could be.
So
that's the first thing you've said that's made sense.
But you are attributing it to...
I'm not attributing it to... I'm saying this is the hypothesis.
And this is promiscuity.
And when they look at other primates, which also have sex face-to-face, by the way, other primates have sex face-to-face.
Right.
So, every sexual position we do, they do.
Right.
And they see a correlation between promiscuity and penis size.
Okay. That's stronger. Okay. So the fact is that they've seen
That's what I said at the beginning.
Okay.
Not to be argumentative,
sure.
but that's what I said. But, your point is well taken. It just doesn't discount, what I believe to be the strong evidence when you actually look at the other species of primates in particular, and really all mammals.
I just always imagine, like, because there's also other things about our bodies that are weird, like, why are mammals, a lot of them, our testicles are outside? Why do you think that is? It's for the heat, right? It's mostly for the heat.
Yeah. But there's variation in primates in terms of how big the scrotum is, how far the testes are away from the body. Like, there's variation. Why do you think that is?
Because I'm imagining a gorilla generates a ton more heat inside their body than we do,
and their testes would be further away from their body.
You would think so,
but they're not. They're a lot closer.
Okay, so that disproves that.
Right. So why do you think then, now that you know that data point?
Well, I don't know, because all I've ever heard is that the testes are away from the body to regulate the heat.
Yeah. So the further the testes are away from the body, the more sperm it can produce.
Sure.
Because sperm needs to, I don't understand why, it's this cruel joke that God played on men, that it needs to be hanging outside the body. I always wonder, it's like no other organ has to, like the penis has to be outside the body because it has a purpose, but my kidneys aren't hanging outside my body, and of course the biologists will say, well, the reason why the kidneys are outside the body is because they don't function when it's warm. Well, every other organ managed to keep up with the temperature regulation system.
What about the testes?
Why the goddamn testicles have to...
Oh, so are you saying that gorillas don't need to generate as much sperm?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
So,
sure.
When you have more female promiscuity, you have species that have more sperm.
But again, like the testes are outside the body in the first place to keep the temperature down so that there's more or less sperm, right? In this case, the gorilla doesn't have to have as much sex, doesn't need as much sperm because they have a more guaranteed mate, right? So then the testes shrink back up, right? So but then which one came first, right? Because like it could be that they got really buff because they had testes closer to the body, so they needed to guarantee that their females didn't get,
Well, it could be. I mean, and the to get in the higher philosophical argument of when we talk about these things, we tend to talk about, because this, right?
Yeah.
But it's random mutation of genes that tends to survive to the next generation. And so the way you just phrased that is quote unquote, accurate because there's no way of determining, because there's no thinking man behind the design. So
there's correlation between, there's been observed correlation between female promiscuity and penis size in primates.
And sperm count.
And which came first and why and blah, blah, blah. That's what's hard to know. But that's the observed correlation.
So when we look at ourselves, imagine 300,000 years ago, like here's an analogy or a thought experiment. Aliens come to the planet 300,000 years ago and they start cataloging all the animals. But after a while, they're like, well, we don't want to have to observe every animal. Let's look for heuristics to follow. So they get to the primates and they don't see humans yet. And they're like, okay, well, seems there's a correlation with bigger penises, lower testicles, more sperm count, tends to, and then we observe more promiscuity for the females, meaning that when they're in estrus, they have sex with a lot more males.
Right.
And smaller penises the opposite. And then they stumble across humans and they're like, okay, well, we must know what they do because of all the 200 other primate species have told us pretty clear correlations. We know what humans are doing because of X, Y, and Z. Yeah. That's essentially what we're doing. But they don't know. The aliens don't know. They haven't observed the humans, but they could make some pretty good educated guesses. And so that's what we're doing. We're looking at all the other primates and we're going, well, we have all the correlation. If we fit ourselves into the spectrum of penis size, scrotum, vagina, also body differences between male and female, which I'll get to in a second, then in all likelihood, we looked like chimps and bonobos, which is, multiple partners for everybody, men and women.
Right.
But we don't know that because...
Okay, and then here's a counter view is... hey, we're looking at humans. They seem to pair bond with like mostly one person for a while. So at the same time, it looks like the female can only conceive like in certain very narrow situations. And once they're pregnant for like a year. So they can't have like more babies during that time. Man, so that must be why they're trying to guarantee biologically that it's going to work. So that tends to explain why they have higher sperm count, penis that can go in as far as it can to get the sperm as close to the egg as possible, why they seem to be horny all the time. You see, like they could observe the humans and conclude these conclusions from the fact that we don't have that many tries at it.
But yes. But you understand what I'm saying is that when we look at primates today, and we measure the penis, and we count the amount of partners they have.
Oh, totally. No, like if the aliens watched the primates, then they might be like, oh, wait a minute. No. There seems to be another trend here. Right. The humans seem to subvert that trend because of their society, but blah, 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 blah. But I'm trying to point out that like you could also have seen similar evolutionary decisions if everything else still being the same, but you're just trying to maximize your chances.
Totally. I mean, that's the point is like you can, and people do make up literally any story you want to.
Right.
Given observation, and people have, they'll be
because
like,
the same thing would happen, right? Like the males with the smaller penises would still die off because they had their one monogamous partner and they never had kids, and they tried for years and it didn't work.
Yeah. So another thing that people point to is that our penises, we have these mushroom heads, if you will,
right,
on our penises in general. And do you know what the speculation about this is?
Just isn't it like to try to keep it in a little bit? Like,
so that's
not extreme as like the dog one, but
could be. But you haven't heard the other speculation?
No.
So the other speculation is that, and people will talk about it as if it's fact, that it's a scoop that scoops out previous.
Oh yes. I have heard that. That's true. That's true.
It scoops out previous ejaculate, and that, and so some people consider this fact, and it's interesting because what people will say on the internet, it's like, oh well, that's why men are sort of ravenous for sex, and that's why because we evolved basically from a species that raped women, and it's interesting because it's like, well, there's another angle here of like the women actually invited 10 people to have sex with her.
Sure.
She actually wanted it. She, it wasn't imposed on her. And
because she wants to reproduce, she wants to have a child.
Right. Now, some species are, like ducks, have a more, shall we say, rape culture. But anyway, so we're a scientific species. Let's design a study to determine if this hypothesis has evidence or not. So the hypothesis, we have a mushroom shaped penis top because women would have sex with multiple males when they were in estrus or all the time, and the mushroom scoop evolved to get rid of previous sperm inside the vagina. How do we design that study?
Can I raise my hand here?
Yeah.
Can I ask a question? When you have a tube and it's filled with some fluid, if I put another tube, a cylinder into that tube, and the cylinder has like a little plunger at the top, the first time I pump it in, what happens to that fluid? Does it go out or in? No, if anything, the second dude with
okay, so you have a hypothesis.
Right.
Let's design a study.
Right.
What's the study design?
Well, we try some fluid dynamics. We simulate some penises and vaginas, put some fluids.
Tell me specifically. We got to tell me specifically.
Yeah, we're going to literally make fake vaginas out of...
Oh, fake vaginas.
Yeah, fake vaginas, fake penises. We put fluid in that's the similar consistency, viscosity as cum. And we do some pumping studies and see how much of it stays in, how much of it goes further in, how much of it goes out.
There's something...
And then we vary the shape of does penis have a bulb or no bulb, and blah, 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 blah.
There's something about the word cum I just don't like. It just sounds...
Sorry, ejaculate.
Yeah, that's more sexy to me. Yeah, okay, so that's one study. What's another study? So what's the limitations to that study?
Human motion during the act.
What else?
I mean, it's not exactly the same materials.
Right, good. What else?
The time length, you don't know exactly how long between this, you'd have to try. You could introduce that into the experiment, though.
There's one variable that you haven't mentioned yet that is a limitation to that study.
I don't know.
It's you can't simulate conception with that.
Well, sure, but you can't simulate conception, period, right?
You can.
Well...
You can't ethically, but that's a major limitation, Berto. Like you can't, with all the other studies that they've done previously, you're assuming, which is a strong assumption, but not necessarily true, that the cubic centimeters of ejaculate that gets through to the uterus correlates with the chance of conception, but you just don't really know.
But we just took that correlation at face value for explaining why penises got bigger.
And we can't test that hypothesis because we just don't know.
Right.
We have to conclude that that's a limitation.
Right. But I was trying to sort of like disprove. Let me put it this way. the hypothesis I was going in wasn't that conception happened, was that more cum was removed by the bulbous head. And I'm saying that you could run that experiment and see whether or not it gets removed.
Okay, good. So if that's the hypothesis, but that's not the critical hypothesis. The critical hypothesis is that the shape of the penis increases likelihood of conception. That's the critical hypothesis.
That's not what I understood. It was that it decreases the chances that the previous ejaculate led to conception.
Okay. And increases the likelihood.
Because the hidden hypothesis is that ejaculate that stays within, and especially closer to the egg, is more likely to impregnate the egg.
Right. But, it's just,
But the shape of the head, by the way, is not scraping the inside of the uterus.
Right. So it's we have limitations with your, sound design. Also, what they'll do is they'll take, real people.
Right.
And they'll put something inside, and then they'll have one couple have sex. In order to really design like an effective study that would actually be an effective, valid test would be you would have a number of women volunteer during estrus to have sex with, 10 different men, and you would make sure you kept track of who had sex, who had sex when, in which order. And then you would do this thousands of times, and you would figure out at what point in that sequence of males is the most optimal to get the woman pregnant. Is it the first? Is it the fifth? Is it the 10th? Or is it all the same?
But you still wouldn't prove your original hypothesis necessarily.
Well, I guess, you're right. Because there's other things. Yeah, there's a lot of variables.
Factors,
but you'd be closer to an answer.
It could have been the more acidic sperm. It could have been the first sperm just gets everything readied up, but you need the latter sperm for the
right. Or the woman gets more turned on, and therefore whatever. And so you'd have to test all those, and you'd have to limit or control for all those variables. But anyway, there's not a lot of effort to have that kind of study, and so we just don't know. And so on the internet they'll say, "Oh, penis scoops." That means men were raping women, but there's not.
Again, I still don't understand how a hermetically sealed pumping the previous fluid closer to the uterus is leading to the.
So they have done studies with dildos and with women. And they will put some kind of viscous fluid up there, and then do the pumping. And they do find that it does remove a fair amount.
Oh, okay.
Or some amount that's not insignificant. Anyway, so the other thing we get to here is that men are bigger than women, and so what does that tell us about other primates and ourselves? Because human males are bigger than women. So some people will point to, and I think you have in the past, that this points to evidence that we are like gorillas, and that we come from a history of, I don't think you believe this anymore, but, and I don't know if you said it, but anyway, people will say this, is that...
What I have said about the size was that males dominated females throughout most of history because of their size.
And prior to agriculture...
I didn't distinguish that.
Right. So that is dubious, because if you just look at gorillas only, then it seems, logical. But if we look at all primates, let's look at all primates. So gorillas, for example, they have high sexual dimorphism. The male is what times bigger than the female? So if 1-to-1 is equal...
60%.
Close. So 1.5, which I think is 50%. I'm not quite sure how that works out. But so the male is 1.5 times on average as big as the female, which seems weird to me, because I would think they were like 3 times as big. Because man, when you see those silverbacks, man, it's just like they're just
But
huge.
A female gorilla is nothing to fuck with. No problem.
Right. So in this natural state, we see generally one dominant male, several females.
Right.
Okay. So now let's work our way down the spectrum. Chimps and bonobos.
And by the way, that is the way that I think the MGTOW or incel community sees the world is
Right.
that there's a few silverbacks out there getting all the sex from all the females.
Well, or our natural state of affairs is for women to succumb to men's power.
Sure.
And that women should hand themselves over. I don't know, anyway. Chimps and bonobos, what times are they? Again, gorillas 1.5, chimps and bonobos.
Chimps are like 1.2.
Good. So chimps and bonobos 1.2, 1.3. So this is, moderate sexual.
Oh, I thought the female was a little larger for the bonobos.
No, the males are bigger.
Okay.
Males are bigger. Now, if we project into the future another 5 million years, maybe we would see that because there isn't as much of a need. In fact, if I remember right, the differences are smaller in bonobos than in chimps.
I see.
So with chimps and bonobos, they have very complex sexual lives that are very different from gorillas.
Yeah.
Sometimes dominant males will get more access and restrict access to females. But in general, females tend to mate with several males within and without the tribe. So what does this mean? Because we would think that since chimps and bonobos are at least close to gorillas in terms of the dimorphism between males and females, that we would see at least, closer to gorillas. But actually we see this completely other system that isn't a shade off of gorillas. Right. It's like very different. In gorilla society, there tends to be like consistent sex between, like a female will, if she's mating with a guy right now, she probably will mate with that guy next year. You know what I mean? Whereas in chimps and bonobo society, it's like it tends to be more random than that.
All over the place.
Okay, so then we look at gibbons. They're virtually the same size. And we see with them that they are generally monogamous. They sometimes have dalliances. They sometimes have quote-unquote divorces. But in general, at the very least, for periods of time, they tend to mate with only one person, virtually the same size. And the speculation is that, males don't have to be bigger because the species has an instinct for pair bonding.
Yeah.
And so once you find your mate, other males come along and say, oh, well, she's already taken.
Sure.
So what's the point? And I don't need to be bigger to fight that guy. I'll find there's a lid for every pot here. I'll find my female. Marmosets, which are very cute, very small primates. The female slightly bigger, but not by much, but slightly bigger. So what behavior might we expect here?
The marmoset females are slightly bigger.
Yeah.
That potentially the female is protective of. They're a little more protective of their males.
Okay.
So
Good.
The one female might have a few males, but they're protective of them.
Excellent. So exactly. So that's what we see. So now you're getting when we look at a variable, you actually can see a difference in behavior.
Right.
And we see that in marmosets, there's some females that have more than one male. So it's like, and that competition, females will fight each other and, for the males. Now humans, so gorillas 1.5, chimps and bonobos 1.3, 1.2, gibbons the same, marmosets, the female is like 1.1-ish. What's the human ratio?
Yeah, like 1.2 maybe.
1.1.
1.1.
So males are, we're very close to gibbons. We're closer to gibbons in terms of dimorphism than we are to chimps and bonobos. But what does this mean? So if we fit ourselves into the spectrum, it would seem, again, it's not a accurate way of looking at biology and behavior, but it's possible that we're like gibbons in that we like monogamy.
Yeah.
There's not a lot of competition among men for the females. We tend to latch up and pair up, and then we stick with that person. But males are a little bigger, so there is a little competition. And so maybe we're mostly monogamous, but we definitely have a non-monogamous side to us, which seems to correlate with our behavior and our, when you sort of look at people's preferences in life, it seems to reflect that.
And then I also think we got to think of the mix of variables. For example, if gorillas were thrust into an experience where they didn't have abundant resources and they became violent, man, that would be trouble, right?
Yeah.
Their violence levels would go up. And being how powerful they are, the women would probably suffer quite a bit. Each other, the ones that weren't as powerful, would die a lot more. All these kind of things. So it feels like humans were like this. Is why I kept saying humans were sort of like this half bonobo, half chimp, thrust into a very aggressive chimp-like situation, and when the shift happened to more agricultural societies. And so then a lot of violence ensued.
Right.
And unfortunately, at that point, the slight size advantage did play a role.
Right. Yeah. Interesting way of looking at it for sure. All right. So let's conclude. So I want to provide some opinions from other people. So from the blog article author, Patrick Clarkin, PhD, he says, our evolutionary story seems to want to defy a simple narrative.
Yeah.
So his conclusion was and I only went over like 20% of his notes, kind of a thing. And his conclusion after looking at all the different angles, he's just like, this is not a simple story. This is really this is a hard story. In the entirety, we have a story. We have a lot of different things to say, a lot of different data to look at. But man, it is hard to know, like what we are, quote unquote, naturally. And even the question of natural state is problematic. You know what I mean? So also, according to me, this is my conclusion, there's a lot of evidence going in different directions. There's a lot of variation across our species, both individually and culturally. So what does that mean? I think we clearly have a drive for variety on some level. It seems to be, when you look at all the evidence and you look at the biological evidence and the morphology and the other species, I think it's probable that we all have an inner bonobo and chimp who, both men and women, who have a drive. Again, it's a drive. It's not like a intellectual preference. It's like the chimp who has sex with a dozen males while she's in estrus. It's not like she wakes up in the morning and says, I think I'll have sexual, it's
just a drive.
It's pleasurable. It's like, yes, let's do this. This is what
time of the year.
Yeah. Come on, you next. Come on, let's go. And so I think, given the evidence, I think we clearly, on average, because some people don't even want to have sex at all, by the way, but on average, we clearly have a drive for at least some variety. And we clearly have a drive for pair bonding. I mean, that is clear. We fall in love. We don't fall in love with 5 people at once. I mean, even polyamorous people will recognize new relationship energy. And that's not at 5 people, that's at one person. You're just like, oh my God, you. Your eyes and your everything and I just want to do you all the time, And so we clearly have a drive, and that seems to last for at least some period of time.
Right.
A year, 5 years, whatever we want to put to it.
And remembering that our heads got so much bigger comparatively than even our closest primates. So the pregnancy and birth and early childhood became that much more dangerous, like what we were saying earlier.
Right. The need to take care of offspring is greater than it is for other primates because of the abnormally sized head of our offspring and the long period of time that it takes the infant to actually survive on its own. It always just boggles me when I see a horse is born and within like 5 minutes it's walking around and looking like, it's like the equivalent of being like a 10-year-old human. It comes out of the womb as a 10-year-old already. And we are just woefully helpless for years because of the cost benefit was like, well, the cost is we're helpless for the first 5 years, but the benefit is you get this giant brain.
Yeah.
And that can help you figure things out. So Patrick Clarkin, PhD, also wrote that Ken Rice wrote, "We are hardwired not to be hardwired." So I love this phrase.
Yeah.
So we're naturally adaptive.
Yeah.
So if we're trying to look for what are we naturally? Are we monogamous? Are we polyamorous? What are we naturally? Well, there seems to be a lot of evidence that we are naturally we're naturally not anything.
Yeah.
Our nature is to adapt not only to our environment in terms of food and resources, but also to the society that we grow up in.
Yeah.
If our society is extremely monogamous, then we adapt to that.
Yeah.
If our society says jealousy is bad and men and women can have, sex with other people, it's fine, then we adapt to that.
We're very programmable.
And we can even reprogram ourselves midway through life.
Yeah.
There are people who grow up monogamous and do monogamy, and then boom, they're swinging their polyamory, and this a whole other lifestyle. We are clearly, and they are happy and they thrive. There are so many different ways to thrive relationship-wise and sexually-wise. So we clearly were designed to be flexible.
Yeah, minus the kind of the built-in hormones and cycles that we don't seem to be able to adapt actually well at all.
Right, like we can't we can't. Well, that's not even true. I was going to say we can't fall in love with a tree, but we can fall in love with a tree.
Well, it's more like you can't tell yourself don't feel a certain way about that person right now.
Yeah,
that's not a thing most humans can do.
No,
you can try really hard, but mostly there's a lot of these chemicals that just get fired anyways.
But I would contend, and so would these people, that the culture you grow up in will determine where that drive is pointed and how intense it is.
Sure, I could see that.
Yeah. Wow, I'm glad I thought I was going to get pushback on that.
No, not on that, because you're basically saying, no, I totally agree.
But I'm glad it's like, I've pulled you over to my side.
Well, as an example, yes, you're right. As an example, if as an infant, your pleasure is regularly rewarded in a certain way, I think that's going to reinforce.
Right, epigenetics. So you have neurons that are set to be set that way. And through puberty, for example, you're 13 years old and all those romantic and sexual hormones are starting to kick in and your brain is starting to wire itself for sex.
Right.
And around you is romantic comedies and roses and chocolates and getting down on one knee. And when you're a 25-year-old woman, and let's just even say you're a lesbian, and your gay partner, she gets down on her knee, your body is going to have a physiological fucking reaction. Now, did you evolve to have a physiological reaction when she gets down on a knee? No. Because we're so adaptive and our brain is so able to just absorb, and I mean, it just freaks me out sometimes to think about this, because it's just like our brain is,
so programmable.
It's like this weird octopus that's like reaching out and feeling the world. I just had this vision of, octopus with all these tentacles, like blindly feeling around and go, oh, okay, I got you there, and it's just, and it's starting to, form this new brain. It's, like the world is black, so, I'm going to change myself black to fit in with this world. It's creepy when you think about it.
Well, and hence why, I think we have great proof, sadly, when you see bad development in that, why is this person attracted and sexually stimulated by violence, right? Oh, look, they were subjected to violence during these development phases,
right?
And they were adapted to that. Certainly, they didn't evolve to automatically want that violence,
right? So to conclude, from Patrick Clarkin, PhD blog, are we naturally blank? I guess I can't remember the exact title, but he says, perhaps the question is not whether humans are naturally monogamous. Instead, we should ask, what are the relative sizes of the center and the periphery, and how much variation there is around them, and what factors affect these? So I just love that.
Yeah.
And as the great Dan Savage said, we are monogamish.
Yeah, that's great. I find that way more useful than saying we're not or we are.
But it's kind of freaky.
Sure.
And it's kind of scary because it's like, well, what's the answer? Particularly if you're unhappy out there.
Sure.
It's like, well, so what's the answer? Like, what am I supposed to do? You know, what's the road to happiness? And on one level, it's scary because we don't have a roadmap. But on the other, it's like, you know, you're free to explore and discover. And there's a lot of flexibility there. At the very least, what we can say, I think, and we talk about this often, is like, we need to stop judging other people for their lifestyles. You know, if someone doesn't want to ever get married and they don't want to ever have kids and they want to have, you know, you have a woman who's like, from the age of 16, she's just like, I want to have sex with a different person every week.
Yeah.
We need to stop judging that.
Sure.
There is nothing wrong with that. Well, oh, STIs. There are ways, there's ways to prevent STIs. Because what if that woman at 16 and, you know, throughout the rest of her life, that is her optimal lifestyle.
Yeah.
And then she isn't able to do that. And we shove her into this monogamous world and she gets depressed and she cheats and she beats herself up and she starts to develop excuses like, well, I guess I'm just a terrible person.
Yeah.
And, you know, now I'm not justifying cheating by any stretch of the imagination.
No, but it's like, because you look at the opposite case too, which is someone who is not in relationships for very long, and yet when you ask them, what do you want of your life, say when you're older or in 20 years, 30 years, like, well, I don't know, I want to have a family. I want to have people around me that care about me and like grandkids and all these things. Well, then you could say, well, maybe what you're doing then is not conducive towards that. But it's not because it's more natural or not. It's just what you want doesn't align with your behavior.
Right. And so we need to start looking critically at our society, at our laws, at our policies, at our culture, at our stigma. And each one of us has to not only question, am I living the life I want to live?
Yeah.
And also we have to listen more carefully when other people are, you know, talking about these decisions or exhibiting behaviors. We have to be careful about like not labeling things as bad and good. That's a very hard thing for us to do. The last thing I'll say is that, and related to what I just said, was that there's, for each one of you out there, including me and Humberto, there's a lot of potential paths to happiness. There's probably not one path to the optimal happiness. That's my conclusion for myself, because I'm in a monogamous relationship with my wife, and I love her and like that arrangement. Now, if I look at all these data and I'm like, well, so maybe I could have a happy life without that.
Right.
And, you know, it's compelling, you know, when you look at chimps and bonobos and the penis size.
Meaning you want chimps and bonobos? That's called bestiality.
You just say, wow, you know, maybe I've been shoved into a hole that, you know, it's not the full me.
Sure.
Well, now it would be perfectly fine for me to explore that and to ethically figure out a solution to that, you know. But for me, I'll just tell you, I am fine with, if I'm on one track of 10 tracks that are available to me, I'm fine with that. I like this track.
Right.
There's pros and cons to any of the fucking tracks.
Yeah.
And this track, I like the pros and I'll take the cons.
It absolutely. It's like what you do right now. What are you doing daily for your life? Well, you are recording into a microphone. Is that the only thing you can do?
Yeah.
There's a billion things you could do.
Right.
And there's pros and cons.
Yeah.
Like talking to a mic means I have to talk into the mic too, so that's a con. But, you know, there's pros. Like you get to give me gifts.
Well, I haven't been recording your end of the conversation.
Damn it. Not even the echo.
So if you've been listening thus far, I think we've been talking for 3 hours.
Holy crap.
And you are not a patron. I just want to publicly shame that right now.
That is not the way evolution should have played out.
Yeah. So
think about all those bonobos that would become patrons if they had the brain size.
Yeah. Becoming a patron is, every now and then I'll get an email saying a new person became a patron. And it's a wonderful, wonderful feeling to be validated in that way. It's one thing for someone to listen. It's another thing to be like, you know what? I like your product that much that I'm willing to, contribute to it. Because when you're contributing, it's not just a trivial thing to us.
Right.
Like the contributions mean that me and Humberto get to spend a lot more time away from other, needed money-making schemes.
More bonobo schemes.
Our regular jobs,
Yes.
to be specific, so that we can, this episode, for example. Now I'm just going on a pledge drive, but just forgive me for a second. This episode, for example, Are Humans Made for Monogamy? This took me probably like 3 weeks.
Yeah.
Took me, 4 hours a day on average. Some days it was all day, like, 16 hours all day long, looking at the science. Now, some of you biologists out there are just like, oh my God, well, Jesus.
Join the club.
Well, you should have done it more because some of your BS,
Well, but I had to do like 3 hard weeks of alternating between massive polygamy and massive monogamy.
to find out.
Yeah.
So that'd be a good band name, Massive Polygamy. Up next, Massive Polygamy.
And their songs are like,
It's
in the forest we are happy together.
having sex with everyone.
And bonobos too.
Long phalluses are needed to compete with John because no one likes John. So becoming a patron with every, additional person who becomes a patron, that means that we get to continue doing this. And if even more people become patrons, it means that we could spend even more time and and I would have the ability to spend even more time like researching topics and going deep
We could
dives.
travel to the Congo even.
We could. And observe ourselves. Berto's gone native. He's out there.
Berto.
That's an old inside joke of ours. All right. Well, that does it for that episode of Psychology in Seattle. Thanks for joining us out there. Let us know what you think. Comment below. I am curious, as particularly to you experts out there, what did I get wrong? What did I get right? And for you, all you other non-experts out there, how do you feel about monogamy? What's your path? Some of you out there are way beyond monogamy. You're fully polyamorous, and you figured out the whole system. Let us know what you think. Did we say anything that upset you, that triggered you? Keep that to your fucking self. I don't want to hear it. Just joking. Be polite. Feel free to comment below. And please take care of yourself because
You deserve it.